My name is Brendan Thompson. I am the Municipal Stormwater Coordinator here at the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. And I am going to be talking to you very briefly and basically about why we have the LID requirements and provide some regulatory background on that. So the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, we are one of 9 regional boards that the state of California formed in 1969. And because California is such a large state, they recognize that there's different regions with unique climate, geology, hydrology, topography that warrants dividing the state into these regions to address water quality issues. And all the regional boards, we implement and enforce not only state water quality laws, but also federal water quality laws. So the state law we implement and enforce is our laws underneath the California Water Code. And then the federal laws that the regional boards have been delegated to implement and enforce, that would be regulations coming from the famous Clean Water Act. So that is who we are and what we do. Now, low impact development. When we're talking about low impact development, we're generally talking about strategies to infiltrate stormwater where it falls to the ground or close to where it falls, similar to what would happen in undeveloped conditions. And so we're going to be talking about the maintenance of some of these LID features like the ones listed here. And it's a very important topic because these are important features for water quality. It can be a challenge to get them in, and it can sometimes be an even bigger challenge to make sure they stay functional and that they're maintained. So that's why everyone saw the need for this training. And often when we're talking about low impact development features, we're talking about controlling stormwater. So briefly, what it means to control stormwater. Stormwater can be some pretty nasty, dirty stuff. And here's a list of common pollutants that are found in stormwater, such as sediment or dirt, trash, metals, bacteria, pesticides, nutrients, petroleum products. And LID features can help control and treat all of these pollutants. I have an asterisk here next to petroleum products because Nick Sedano at Santa Rosa got nervous when he saw this here, knowing that if you send a bunch of petroleum products to your LID feature, it could very well ruin your LID feature by killing the plants. So if you're going to be treating stormwater runoff from a gas station or a very polluted parking lot, you may want to put in an oil grease separator before your stormwater gets to your LID feature. And also, it's not just the pollutants within stormwater, but it's the stormwater itself. In undeveloped conditions, you have water falling from the sky, it hits the ground, it infiltrates into the ground, and not until the ground is fully saturated will you start getting water running off and going to your creeks. And before development, all our creeks were used to that kind of pattern. But now that we've put in parking lots and streets and sidewalks, the rain falls from the sky, it hits those surfaces, it has nowhere to go except straight over those impervious surfaces, straight to the creeks. And what we've seen over the years is that when all that water runs over those impervious surfaces, it gets to the creek at the same time, and it has a lot more energy, and it causes the creeks to scour out, and you get degraded creeks, and you get a bunch of sediment being dislodged and deposited downstream, smothering aquatic habitat. So that's what we call hydromodification, and we're trying to control that through use of these LID features. So the regulatory hooks, the regulatory need for LID. The Clean Water Act has been around a long time, and prior to 1987, it mainly dealt with pollution coming from wastewater treatment plants or factories, basically big facilities where you got wastewater being discharged to creeks through one pipe. And in the 80s, they recognized that our creeks and our rivers and other water bodies were still unacceptably polluted, and that a lot of that pollution was coming from our cities, just from stormwater runoff, running off from our cities and our county areas. So the 1987 Clean Water Act Amendment said, hey, cities, counties, you're gonna need permits to discharge stormwater, and those permits are gonna come with a lot of requirements. So the need for these LID features comes out of that in part. And additionally, I mentioned we're in the North Coast region here, and we have our own unique water quality issues here. In the Russian River watershed, we recognize that bacteria is affecting water quality in our watershed. And so we have requirements unique to the Russian River watershed that require control of bacteria, and LID is just one tool to address those impairments. Also sediment. The entire North Coast region is impaired by sediment. Our creeks and our rivers have an excess amount of sediment, and even though the runoff from municipalities is a relatively modest percentage of that total sediment, installing LID features is one of the tools that's used to control sediment. And then finally, statewide, trash has been recognized as a significant water quality issue, and virtually all the cities and county jurisdictions throughout the state are now required to capture most of their trash, and those requirements are significant. They're going to be hard to meet, and the LID features are a huge part of controlling that trash. Finally, we're here to talk about maintenance today, and just wanted to let you know that the stormwater permit for the Russian River discharge for the Russian River cities and the county, they have requirements to make sure that all these LID features are maintained, not only for the LID features that are within their right-of-way or that they own, but also the ones on private property. So if somebody comes in and wants to develop a project and has to install a LID feature, the cities or the county need to make sure that there's a legally binding maintenance declaration that that those BMPs remain fully functional for the life of the project, and that if the land is sold, that the maintenance responsibilities carry over to the new owner, and also depending on what city or jurisdiction you're in, the private owners of these LID features need to submit annual verification that their BMPs are being maintained. And so maintenance is a requirement, as well as the basic requirement to just have the LID feature. So it's very important they be maintained and stay functional, and it's a requirement. Finally, that's all I got. Nick and Aaron's presentation is fantastic. I look forward to it. If anybody has any questions about stormwater, feel free to call me or email me. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Nick and Aaron.
Let me just jump in real quick before we pass it off to Nick and Aaron. So thank you, Brendan. For those of you who may have arrived late, welcome to this year's annual Stormwater LID training. I'm John Caldwell, City of Cotati, facilitating the meeting. We are recording. I don't see any questions yet. You will want to keep that contact info from Brendan. He's a good one to have. Us co-permittees, we're essentially the regulatory bodies, or you answer to us in some form or fashion probably, but we answer to him. He's kind of the top of the line. So he's an important one to have. But yeah, we're going to be covering a broad range of stormwater LID topics, but honing in on maintenance in particular. Thank you very much, Nick and Aaron, for putting together this presentation. Without any further ado, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Can you guys all hear me?
Yep.
I can't see you, so I'm hoping this will be a little more interactive because I can't see your faces because I'm looking at a presenter screen. So I am actually hoping this is going to be a little more interactive. And so I would tell you, if you've got a question and we're on a slide, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can type it in the chat and we'll try to answer that question as it comes up, or when an appropriate time comes in. And again, this is really meant to be more interactive than me just up here barking at you. And for those of you that don't know, I'm Nick Sudano, and I work with the City of Santa Rosa, and I manage our Stormwater MS4 NPDES permit. So Aaron Nunez also works with me in the City of Santa Rosa and helps us to stay in compliance with our permit as well too, and has been integral in our low impact development program. So I just want to let you know, we are going to try to break the presentation up a little bit so you guys don't just get a bunch of people talking at you. And so we're going to try to make it interactive. So you will get asked questions along the way, so pay attention for those. You'll have a survey to fill out, and then we'll give you the answers to those surveys in real time. And so be on the lookout for a pop-up question. And speaking of which, let's give you your first pop-up question. And let's see who we have on the presentation. So really what we want to know is what part of interaction of LID features do you represent? Are you a landscaper, a contractor, an engineer? Are you representing municipal staff? If you could fill out the poll that just popped up, that would be great. That'll give us an idea on how we're going to flow with this presentation. But I will tell you that our presentation right now is kind of mostly geared towards contractors, inspectors, and landscapers. And but I will tell you that this presentation is going to intersect and interweave in many different ways. And although we might be focusing on one professional trade versus the other, it all impacts each other, and it's all relevant from the time that it's constructed or even designed for that matter to the time when it's handed over to an owner to maintain. And for those of you designers on the call, I just wanted to say what you're going to see are some of our common issues that we find with LID features, kind of what we've learned in the evolution of the LID program up here in the North Coast. And so we're going to kind of share some of our successes and some of our failures as well too. So, and hopefully that helps you on the design end. And Elizabeth, do we have the answer to that pop-up question, just out of curiosity? Just curious what it looks like.
Yes,
So,
it's now showing.
Great.
Can you see it, Nick? Or
I can.
Okay.
So that helps me out a little bit. Looks like we've got a lot of municipal employees and design engineers. It's great to see that contractors, owners, and landscapers are also being represented, as well as inspection staff. So this is perfect. Thank you. And I think you're going to get a second pop-up question here as well, so you can answer that while I'm kind of going through all of this. But I did want to let you guys all know that really this is intended to help you understand what we're looking for when we're inspecting these features for basically required maintenance. As Brendan pointed out, there's a legal responsibility by the owners to maintain these features for the perpetuity of you know the feature for the lifespan of it, and we are required to inspect these features by our permit. And each municipality kind of has its own inspection program that can range from anywhere from annual to biannual, but you should be or the owners have a requirement under their maintenance declaration to actually maintain these annually, and sometimes it's even more frequent than that, depending on the type of feature that you have. So with that said, What I wanted to tell you is that we're hoping that you're going to find this training incredibly helpful. Yes, I do love puns, so watch out for them. But if you catch us monologuing, feel free to jump in and say, hey, move on. And we already got this. Again, we are designing this with the intent that not everybody understands these all the way through. So if we start to kind of ramble or stick on a point, you need us to move forward, put something in the chat and the facilitator will help move me on, and or just chime in and you can ask your question there.
Okay, the
Just
results are sharing there, Nick.
Oh, perfect, thank you. I also want to just invite for the 9 other co-permittees on this call, as well as the Regional Water Quality Control Board, as we go through these slides, if you have anything to add or anything that's specific to your jurisdiction, if you just want to jump in, we're happy to kind of include that dialogue into this presentation. And it's just important to remember that through this entire training, what your involvement is with LID features, but most importantly, that the LID feature is an extension of our storm drain systems. It's an engineered stormwater system that is considered part of our stormwater drainage system. That's protected by our local ordinances, by Regional Water Quality Control Board requirements, and ultimately by EPA regulations. So that is really what's driving this conversation and these compliance inspections.
Well, before we really get into the weeds with everything in this presentation, let's just step back and talk about what is low impact development. And Brennan did a great job breaking that down, but let's just go ahead and drill in a little bit more. In low impact development, there are features that are small scale infiltration based, landscape features that mimic the undeveloped site condition. And they're designed in various ways, shapes and sizes and composition of species and soil media. But really, the main thing to take home here with this presentation and with low impact development as a whole is they're designed to treat and capture stormwater. So treat the pollutants that are suspended in stormwater as it comes off of impervious surfaces, and as well as capture it and decrease hydromodification as we're increasing our impervious surfaces through development. And me myself personally, I come from a background in ecological restoration and doing riparian restoration. So low impact development is something that really excites me because I really see them as kind of these small scale restoration projects that we can integrate into the urban landscape and find all these areas to bring the plants and uptake pollutants and do these little restoration projects throughout the urban interface.
What I would add here too is that if you just take a moment and just think about it, City of Santa Rosa has almost 100 miles of creeks that run through the city. So it doesn't take long once it gets into our storm drain system before it's in that receiving water that goes directly to the Laguna de Santa Rosa, into the Russian River, and ultimately the Pacific Ocean. These LID features are designed to capture that trash, sediment, it's filter pathogens from bacteria, and among many other benefits in here. So when you're looking at these features, again, we just want you to consider these as an engineered stormwater system.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, let's just sit back and talk about why do we care? Why do we want to keep our waterways clean? Well, first off, as we're developing and continuing to develop, we're increasing our impervious surfaces. And it's proven that when you increase these impervious surfaces, we're allowing for pollutants to become suspended in the water rather than being absorbed into the landscape. And if you think about, Nick, when you're talking about the 100 miles of creeks in the city of Santa Rosa, just staying on that example, if you think about it for our city of Santa Rosa, we have over 17,000 inlets. So those are all these points of pollution that can enter into our storm drain system and into our creeks. So if we can find a way to capture that stormwater before it's entering those inlets just right off of a curb or right off of a parking lot, but rather allowing them to infiltrate and interface with vegetation, that helps out so much in terms of decreasing all those multiple points, those 17,000 points of pollution that we might have. And, as we'll go into this presentation, you'll be hearing quite a few acronyms. And I just wanted to kind of at least throw them out there for everyone so we can just become exposed to them. So obviously LID is low impact development. And just in layman's terms, that's a way of designing new development to not impact water quality or volume as much. BMP, it stands for Best Management Practice. For the sake of LID and our conversation today, those are really the features that make up LID, low impact development. So those are, our rain gardens and our vegetated swales or porous pavement. In PDS permit, you'll hear that thrown out there a bit today. And that's really just our permit. That's what's driving our force. That's what our regulation in terms of maintenance and inspection of LID as it becomes installed. And we start to see more of it throughout our city. MS4, that's our municipal separate storm sewer system. You'll hear MS4. Really just think of it as everything that's capturing water and allowing it to flow into our creeks. So, picture yourself as a raindrop falling from the sky and you're going to land on to the street. Well, that's the storm drains, that's the gutters, that's the outfalls and everything where water is being directed. That's what we call our MS4. So you'll be hearing some of these acronyms, and I just wanted to kind of throw them out there. And also for the recording, if you want to come back to this presentation later and you're like, oh, I forgot what that means, you can always come back to this slide and refer to these.
And for you old timers, our original version used to call this SUSUMP. So if we inadvertently call it SUSUMP, it really means LID. So SUSUMP used to stand for Standard Urban Stormwater Mitigation Plan, but SUSUMP equals LID, which equals a post-construction BMP, which again equals an engineered stormwater system. So those are interchangeable, but we're gonna try to stick with the acronym LID just for consistency, but I just wanted to let you guys know that depending on what portion of the design or implementation phase you're working on, you might refer to it from a different terminology.
So, and let's just talk a little bit about impervious surfaces. And these are defined as areas that are modified to where stormwater percolation into the soils has been reduced or eliminated. So it's really easy to think about impervious surfaces as a sidewalk, right? Or a parking lot, but it can also be, a compacted driveway or something where it's just where the percolation has been reduced or eliminated. And LID was created out of the necessity to offset the negative impacts that we are seeing from impervious surfaces as we continue building out our cities. It's really the driving force for LID, and that's where LID comes in and is trying to mitigate for the negative impacts of impervious surfaces.
So as Brendan talked about, it's our municipal MS4 stormwater permits that dictate the LID requirements that our region has. And the MS4 permit is basically for the entire region from Cotati all the way north to Ukiah is covered under this permit. So the 10 cities that you see down here are actually covered under the MS4. And the presentation that we're going to give you today is for the jurisdiction and the boundary that you're seeing on this current slide. Now, what I will tell you is that our permit, the current permit was effective January 6th of 2016. It's currently being renewed. These get renewed every 5 years, but there's always a delay in that renewal cycle. And so likely you're going to see some of the requirements that we're talking about today. Once we get that new permit, you'll see a new LID manual come out that actually will probably have a more stringent requirement or additional requirements just because our permit is an iterative process. We're also incorporating lessons learned in each new edition of those manuals. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. Low impact development, we wanted to throw this up there because, in days of old, you used to be pave it, pipe it, and pollute it. You wanted to get it out of there as quick as possible, but unfortunately we would convey pollutants also to the receiving water just as quickly as we got the stormwater out. And so the new terminology that you all have probably heard or that you're going to hear for the first time today is slow it, spread it, sink it. And with impervious surfaces, stormwater flows into the MS4 and creeks unnaturally very quick. And with the incorporation of these LID features, we can limit those impacts of development. We can treat the stormwater runoff, and we can attempt to mimic natural conditions, which also helps us to decrease some of the flooding risks. This is also helping us with some of the controlling pollutant loading from urban activities, such as runoff from impervious surfaces like rooftops, parking lots, roadways. And each of these BMPs are designed to help reduce the impacts from that runoff. So really, the intent of LID is really treatment, infiltration, and then it also has a flow attenuation component in there as well too. The bottom line again, and I'm going to keep saying it because this is an important part that I think, really has not been connected over the years, is that these are designed systems. They have prescriptive components and they're an engineered stormwater system. So we just threw this graph up. Again, this wasn't meant to be necessarily an overly technical presentation, but we wanted to kind of show you that, the first graph here in green is your pave it, pipe it, pollute it scenario where you're trying to get it out as quick as possible. And again, days of old was get this water out as quick as possible, which they thought would prevent flooding. I think we're kind of learning more these days about really some of the natural conditions and how nature had it right in the first place. And then the blue curve here is kind of the intent of LID, and really kind of mimics really the slow it, spread it, sink it concept. And, with the LID, we can see less spikes in our streets and waterways when we get high rain events. We're spreading out at that intensity, we're holding that water longer, and really we're helping the flow attenuation in our creeks and streams to actually reduce some of the hydromodification that we tend to see when we start to push it out really quickly. So really, the bottom line is that we're trying to mimic some of the natural processes that would be here had human development not come in. Some of the benefits of LID obviously are volume capture. We're lengthening that hold time. We decrease the intensity of that flow. That gives us some flow attenuation. We reduce hydromodification as a result. That decreases erosion. And ultimately, we decrease flood risks that each of our cities face and experience periodically throughout the years. So again, we just wanted to throw this up, just kind of showing the flow attenuation. And again, in the 60s and 70s, it was all about channelizing these creeks, getting the water out as quickly as possible. We've learned that the meanders and natural conditions actually are more beneficial to reducing flood, slowing down that water, and reducing the impacts of stormwater runoff.
Yeah, and I'd like to, also say, I think it's a good point, Nick. You've said it a few times, and I agree. We are mimicking the natural environment. I've seen words thrown out like to reestablish or to restore to the natural environment using LID, but it's really mimicking because we're not going to ever get back to pre-human development. Like for instance, this picture of Santa Rosa Creek downtown, it's locked in, and we have buildings and urban development on both sides. So through LID, it's a way for developers and contractors and landscapers to mimic the natural landscape as best we can to decrease any negative effects that we're having by increasing our impervious surfaces. So I really like that word mimic, Nick. And, just throwing this out here, we're starting to see this more and more often. We had our big, 8 to 12 inch rain event in October that we all dealt with. And there are a lot of studies right now, a lot of climate studies that are claiming that we'll see more instances of this, of a more volatile climate pattern where we'll have drier stretches in the winter and then a really heavy, intense storm coming in to where we'll see more, 5-inch storm events, 10-inch storm events. And with that, that's where LID can come in and help us out with this. Most likely we're not going to be stopping our development right now. We need houses, we need to develop our communities. But LID is a tool to help us with an ever-changing climate. And with an ever-changing climate, I think we need to start to change our practices in development and how we see diverting our stormwater. And LID can help us with the volume capture when it comes to these more volatile storm events that we might be seeing in our future. And LID, it's all throughout the city. All of us drive by LID features going to work. We all walk right by them. Most of us probably live next to LID features. We shop near them. We drop our kids off at school that have LID features in their parking lots. They're at our work, you know, they're at our businesses. They might be in your front yard or your backyard. They're all throughout the city. And once you start to become really familiar with them, you'll start to see them everywhere, and especially in newer development that we're seeing. If you're driving around and you're seeing a new apartment complex or housing development coming in, those are going to have LID features. So keep your eye out for them. We've all been exposed to them. We've all seen them. They are all throughout the city. So I think that's just really interesting to point out. And, you know, these features, they can be quite obvious. You know, we have bioretention with the high flow inlet right there, and then a bunch of Juncus rush species planted, vegetated swales, another bioretention inlet or feature with an inlet at a parking lot. The point is, you know, they're all around and they can be obvious, and they can be all different shapes and sizes and implemented in all different ways. But again, the main point here is we're diverting stormwater to these features to treat them and to capture that volume. And then also, you know, they can be totally inconspicuous. We have features such as porous pavement, permeable gutter pans, trash capture units that are underground, kudo infiltration or detention basins underground meant to just do volume capture. And it's important to note that these type of features are part of what we call a treatment train. And as we go into our presentation, we'll dig into that a little bit more, but I think it's just good to expose everyone to that right now. Really, our priority features that can stand alone as themselves are vegetated features. These are features that where we incorporate vegetation into these bioretention or vegetated swales and treat and capture the water. But we can do treatment trains as well, where they are porous pavement and other sorts of features.
So our permit requires certain triggers for the LID, and the slide you're looking at now actually has those requirements. And, you know, I'm not going to belabor this or go into it too detailed. Just note there are requirements that trigger low impact development to be constructed. With the iterative process of the permit, we would expect to see that the intent is getting closer and closer to every time we do construction that you might end up seeing some of these LID features. But really the trigger here mostly that I want to point out is the 10,000 square feet of impervious surface is either created or replaced is going to trigger an LID requirement. And for municipalities, for those of you in here, there are some exemptions for municipal infrastructure and routine maintenance and emergency activities that won't trigger LID that allow us to continue providing that public benefit. But, you know, again, I just wanted to kind of point out really what is driving some of the LID requirements through our permit. Our current LID manual is the one that you're looking at now. This is a guiding document for our stormwater low impact development. And this is really your design criteria. If you deviate from this, it's going to require an exemption or an exception from the board. And really the way that you would end up figuring this out is that we've started we actually have a design manual starting all the way back from 2005. This is currently the third version of that. And the way to determine what manual your feature is being held to depends on when the project got the CEQA or discretionary approval from the city. Those are the two triggers that lock you into the design manual for that feature. It's important to know that because, again, like you're going to see in the presentation here and like we've talked about, is that we've learned a lot from the earlier versions of the manual. And we've tried to improve these features over time, and to also improve on how they filter and treat stormwater as well too. The LID feature or the LID manuals can be found in a variety of places. So they can be found on some of the local municipalities' websites under stormwater, their development pages. These are also on srcity.org, or you can go to streets2creeks.org, which has a low impact development tab as well, which will give you the 3 manuals for reference materials. And again, this wasn't, you know, in previous years, we've gone into this calculator in great depth, but really what I wanted to point out is that all of these features are designed systems. They're engineered to treat tributary areas. It's required for all LID submittals. So each LID feature has been designed and calculated for the area that it's receiving to be treated. So if any portion of that feature is altered, it impacts the calculation that a design engineer put into creating that feature. This is why this is really important for our inspections and for the maintenance of these features, that these are being maintained the way they were originally intended to be installed.
Hey,
so some of the other things, yeah, go ahead.
Nick, this is Kevin Booker. Jeff Coleman asked a question. I think it's sort of timely. I'm not going to read his whole question, but his final question is, do the regional board and municipalities still support this notion, or, well, I guess, so when Stormwater LID Technical Design Manual was written more than 10 years ago, it was discussed that LID details included in the manual would not be created to accommodate every situation. The details were considered guidelines rather than hard set standards to convey concepts and promote innovative design. Do the regional board and municipalities still support this notion, or is there now a requirement to strictly adhere to the exhibits in the manual?
I can let Brendan chime in on that, because ultimately that is the governing authority. But what I would tell you is that I think it still is a guidance. But if we deviate from that manual, we're going to actually, it requires a different review process and approval to make sure that it's meeting the intent of that LID manual. And Brendan, do you want to speak to that at all?
I was going to say basically what you just said, but you don't have, if you have site-specific constraints or site-specific conditions that necessitate an alternative design that's not in the manual, you're free to propose them. And I say propose because, as Nick said, there is a process. Typically, the city or county would notify us and we would review it. And what we would be looking for is to see if it meets the intent. So are we getting adequate treatment from a system that's going to be reliable, that isn't going to fail? Are we going to get full treatment from a vegetated component? And we are definitely open to that. So you don't have to strictly adhere to the manual.
Nick, can I jump in?
Yep.
Good morning. My name is Yoash Tilis. I'm with the County of Sonoma, and I'm a civil engineer. And I noted earlier there was a second question, a pop-up question. Elizabeth, can you bring that question up? And if not, then some of these, in the next few pop-up questions, in the next couple, including the one that came up, I wanted to provide you some insight in addition to what was presented in the presentation. And I want to apologize in advance if I do repeat some of the concepts, but I think those are important to emphasize given my experience. Yes.
Hey, I don't know that we've got to that pop-up question yet.
It was on the screen earlier, so let's move on and let me know when to jump in.
Yeah, I think we're okay. If you can hold on just a second, Yoash, I think we're going to get to you in a few slides here.
Okay, you're talking about the poll question and not the chat question. Is that correct then? Okay. Go ahead, Nick.
So one of the things that I just wanted to point out that is a requirement of LID submittals is the improvement plans. So the improvement plans will actually have the LID feature on here. And so it is something that we require upon completion of development. And what when we go out to inspect, are inspecting those features too. And so I really wanted just to point this out, that upon construction completion, the cities require, during the city acceptance process and punch list phase, we will be looking at the design components and elements to make sure that they meet the intent of the LID manual. And for those of you contractors on the phone call, one of the better things that you could do is to take photos of your completed LID features, because there is a lag between city acceptance and after you install them. And sometimes you do have homeowners that move in and alter these features. And so that photo helps us to really to know who to hold accountable to get that feature back into compliance the way it was originally designed. These plans are going to have details on here. And one of the things I just wanted to point out, especially for the contractors on the call, is just be aware of your typical sections. Be aware of the notes that are put on here. A lot of times they're going to refer to that LID manual. And so in here, I just wanted to point out that this particular plan set refers to Appendix F, which actually is a planting schedule to make sure that we get the appropriate plants to do the right filtering for this type of feature. There are plants that are approved and there are plants that are not acceptable for these features. And those are things that we're looking for in our annual inspections, and that things that we're required to have either the contractor or the owner to replace and maintain. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. It is a common issue that we're seeing throughout these, even during initial installation, is that, it's not fire life safety, but again, we're talking about an engineered stormwater system, and you get a landscaper that comes in and just wants to put pretty plants in. We need to make sure those plants meet the intent of the LID manual.
Yeah, and I will say, as we were talking about the LID manual and how that is more of a guiding force for those details, and really what Brandon was saying is that it's really to the intent, as long as the intent is the same. But when it comes to these improvement plans and then the details, me as a inspector for a municipality of these LID features, to contractors and developers, this is what I would hold to more of a stringent point, where if I see this detail and right here where it's underlined in red, that it's saying that these plants are going to be planted that are approved per our LID manual per Appendix F. And if I go out there and see that those plants aren't there, then I'm going to be holding you accountable to that. And that's one of the most common things that we see directly post installation of brand new LID features, is that the plantings, called out in the improvement plans are going to be part of Appendix F, but somehow it gets lost in translation when it gets over to the landscaping plans. And like Nick is saying, they're more ornamental species rather than the native desired species. So these are really important in the improvement plans, these details. You'll be held accountable to what is here and what is written.
And if you're a contractor, sometimes these typicals don't have enough information for you. So you might need to put in an RFI and ask for specifics, like what is the soil mix? What is a planting schedule? What is a clear detail for how you're going to install this in a certain scenario, because the typical may not exactly work for what you're looking at. Those are the things that you would be looking for. For the design engineers, sometimes the more detail on here is better. Sometimes they're not always clear. And then I would say also for the landscapers on here, if you're wondering what you can replace or what's the feature supposed to look like or how you're supposed to maintain it, the owner should have access to these maintenance plans, because ultimately they're required to keep the features in the same condition the way it was originally constructed. So these are things that you can ask for along the way. And if your owner doesn't have it, you can reach out to your local municipality, which should also potentially have this in their files as well too. One of the things you want to watch out for as a contractor is things that cause interference. So sometimes you have an LID feature and then, you've got to put in your fire hydrants, you got to put in your light poles, but you've now put it into an engineered stormwater system. And remember, we talked about the calculations that go into these. These pieces are now causing interference, and Whether or not they were considered in that original calculation is an important question. And that's something you want to go back to the design engineer to ask and to make sure that that was addressed and make sure that there's not offset that needs to happen as a result of the interference that happens here. But we see this all the time in construction documents. Sometimes there's just some oversight in design elements and components. And in the field, you're making it work. But for us, when we're inspecting it, we do look for these interferences. We will dig into the plans, and these become issues later on for final acceptance of your project during construction. The other thing that we're looking at is your
Nick,
final, yes.
Sorry, this is Flannery with City of Santa Rosa. One thing I'd like to add is a common way for that to happen is when there's AT&T and PG&E and Comcast coordinations, when the junction structures come in based on the consultant's design plans. So that's something that consultants need to be really careful of, and the contractors, is that coordination touch point from the private utility relocations, because the utility boxes can really wreak havoc on that situation Nick was referring to.
A really good point.
The other piece, third component here of what we are looking at when we go out to do inspections is we're looking at the final LID submittal. This is really important to us. This has a lot of details into essentially the different components and requirements for maintenance of each feature. And what is included in this manual is just general information regarding the site and the type of stormwater BMPs that are required here. It's got the project description. It's got the BMPs that were selected for each trib area and the maintenance that's required there. We get exhibits that are included in here, the volume capture calculations, which become important later on down the line after development, because if an owner wants to alter their site, we now know what they're going to have to replace or offset if they get approval to do that. We've got your C factor calc here, which is your cover management factor, which has to do with surface, your ability of a surface to produce runoff. Your determination worksheet, which basically talks about the triggers for LID, your guide checklist, selection tables, and your fact sheets related to each of those BMPs. So again, for a contractor, you have these to refer to, probably not going to help you out a whole lot. As a landscaper, if you want to know what the maintenance requirements are, or you wanted to know what you could replace with, or you wanted to know what tributary or what area these were intended for, you can come in here and dig in as well too. And then your maintenance declaration tends to be in here too. And usually this is just an example maintenance declaration. Your maintenance declaration is usually separately recorded. And again, this is the legal requirement for the property owner that's tied to that APN that requires these features to be maintained. And it basically talks about the responsibility of the owner to maintain these as originally designed, which we are holding accountable through our local stormwater ordinances for us to be in compliance with our MS4 permits.
Yeah, and so we've been talking about tributaries a little bit, especially pertaining to the calculator. And just to clarify on that, tributary areas are specific areas that drain into a BMP or an LID feature per se. And developers have to select these BMPs which are correctly sized for these tributary areas. So for instance, this project right here, this number 1, you see that's the tributary area and then flows into this detention basin number 1, which matches to it, and so on and so forth. So just to kind of give you a visual of how tributary areas within a project can break down, this kind of helps you visualize that and see how water sheds off of a project and is diverted into various features that are sized for specific tributary areas. And again, these features that are sized for these tributary areas are supposed to be designed to capture 100% of the stormwater and treat 100% of it and the volume within a 1-inch storm event. It says 85th percentile here with this red line. And we moved towards 1 inch now. I believe 85th percentile, at least within the city of Santa Rosa, was like 0.92 inches. So these should be designed to capture all stormwater within a 1-inch storm event. And if you have an event above that, that's where your high flow bypass can come into play and allow water to discharge into the storm drain system without necessarily interacting or being captured by these bioretention areas.
Yeah, and again, just for those of you that have worked in previous manuals, we used to reference the 85th percentile. Our current order no longer references that as the design storm event. It's been replaced with a 1-inch storm event over a 24-hour period. And this change was made in 2016, considering the varying design storm through the jurisdictional boundaries for each of the co-permittees on this existing permit. And so what the board did is they standardized that design storm, which was intended to provide regional consistency, which actually helps you out. So you're not designing this different for each jurisdiction. And they used City of Santa Rosa, like Aaron had pointed out, we were at 0.92 inches, which was our 85th percentile. So they took the 1 inch, which was a more stringent requirement to create the regional consistency from Cotati all the way up to Ukiah. And with that, I think we're going to have our first pop-up question, or I guess our third one.
Yeah, so this is Kevin Booker with Stormwater. I apologize, I was late to the training, but question 3 is on the screen. So if you can take a second and answer it, and we'll give you 30 seconds, and then we'll show you what the results are.
Thanks for taking over as MC, Kevin. Just trying to think of anything I might have missed earlier. There will be a short break about midway through the presentation. There was one question that came up in the chat on permeable pavements. I know Nick and Aaron have slides on that later on in their PowerPoint, so maybe we'll touch on it then, unless they want to address it sooner. But
yeah, and we just got another question in the chat from Kevin K. So let's first, Elizabeth, do you have the results of the question 3? Very good. Yoash, do you want to respond to the results?
Thank you, Kevin. LID BMPs are defined as permanent stormwater BMPs that treat or retain stormwater through a soil filter media or vegetation and/or retain stormwater on site through infiltration or evapotranspiration. LID BMPs are permanent, typically small scale, although large scale is acceptable. Planted features that aim to mimic the hydrologic function of the pre-development site by capturing, treating, and infiltrating stormwater as close to the source as possible. This is from the LID manual, page 9. LID BMPs cannot be maintained or altered from as approved and constructed. To minimize the surface area of the LID BMP, the BMP can be as deep as permitted and could also be permitted with 6 inches of standing water for no longer than 72 hours above the surface area of the BMP, with an overflow mechanism in place. Highest priority bioretention facility LID BMPs are installed without perforated pipe and/or impermeable liners. Infiltration must be provided by the underlying native soil. The same bioretention facility is considered a lower priority BMP if designed with a perforated pipe, installed high in the treatment area, as opposed to at the bottom of the feature, to ensure that delta volume capture occurs in the area below the perforated pipe. Once the volume below the perforated pipe is filled, any additional flow will be collected by the perforated pipe. This filtered stormwater would then be conveyed to the storm drain system. The perforated under drains and the overflow mechanism in LID BMPs are to be maintained in order to function properly. During design and permitting of LID BMPs, documentation is provided to ensure that groundwater will not encroach into the volume capture of the LID BMP. And if standing water is proposed, then documentation that the standing water will drain into the underlying soil below the BMP within 72 hours, in addition to site-specific infiltration tests, must be provided and approved. To better the owner and his or her team of professionals, owner, architect, civil engineers, and if available, contractor can coordinate. The team can determine the existing site conditions, high seasonal groundwater levels, and the site soil types, and aim to ensure that the proposed BMP will function properly and be accessed for maintenance, replacement, and inspection purposes. Discuss the location that would allow for the both capturing and treating the runoff, but also could be located in a visible location that would require minimum access to the site for inspection by the permitting agency. Kevin, back to you.
All right. Thanks, Yawash. Nick and Aaron?
So let's talk about BMP selection a little bit. And according to the LID manual, prioritization needs to be given to small scale landscape-based BMP features. So again, these are vegetated features that are also as close as possible to the source. So we want to be treating this water that's impacted from impervious surfaces from any new development that might be established. We want these features to be as close as possible to them and be vegetated is really what we want to drill home. Offset programs are often discouraged. There have been a few cases of that, but for the most part, we as municipalities want to see these features as close as possible to the impacted area. And here's a list to just kind of throw it out there to everyone of types of features that we'll be seeing out there. And the ones that are highlighted in green are priority treatment features. And what makes those stand apart from the other ones is they're vegetated, right? So these vegetated features are what we call priority features, such as bioretention planters and rain gardens, vegetated swales, and so on and so forth. The ones in black are part of what we call a treatment train. And again, we're going to get into treatment trains further down this presentation, but these are features that are not standalone, and they must be put together to create a train of stormwater treatment to then successfully treat and capture the water. And just how it works in general, I think this is a really good slide to just show. So you'll see the curb cut there, and there's the parking lot, and that's the tributary area. So as the water falls, stormwater is directed into the landscape from the impervious surfaces of the parking lot. And you'll see it's allowed to infiltrate and be filtered through the vegetation. And you'll see as it's entering, it's settling and it's interacting with the vegetation. If you go over the 1-inch storm event, there's the high flow bypass. That should always be unobstructed and functioning correctly. And as this feature, this bioretention feature fills up, then we'll see discharge into that high flow bypass, which then connects to the city MS4 system. And again, here's just another graphic to visualize how these features work. So again, it's raining right here, and you'll see a parking lot, and water is diverted, stormwater is diverted off the impervious surface. It interacts with porous pavement here. So we're actually looking at a treatment train model here, where it interacts with the porous pavement as it's diverted down into the subsoil. There's also curb cuts that go into the vegetated strip, the bioretention strip. Water infiltrates, interacts with the plant and soil medium, and then is diverted down into the subsurface. And again, if it's above a 1-inch storm event, there should be a high flow bypass, and water is diverted there and then into the MS4 system.
You know, and the piece I want to point out here is that the design engineers get this because you guys are designing these systems, but the contractors and the landscapers and inspectors, you guys all need to know how these function too and what the intent is. That's going to help you understand how to actually maintain these and what these are designed to do, and also to find issues when it rains, whether they're performing the way they were originally intended. So understanding why these are here is just as important of understanding how to maintain them.
This is a great graphic here to just explain the various zones that you might see in an LID feature and the plants that should be associated with those zones. LID and Appendix F of the LID manual, which is our plant list, heavily emphasizes native, perennial, drought-tolerant species. They're not all native, but most of them are native, perennial, drought-tolerant species, and they should be planted in specific areas. So here's a diagram just to kind of show and give you an idea as a landscaper or contractor of how they should be designed. And often what I see is people think native, perennial, drought-tolerant, they think that equates to no irrigation, and that's not the case at all. That's often a misconception. These plants they've been evolved and adapted to deal with our Mediterranean climate, where we have long, hot, dry summers that go into wet, cold winters, and they're adapted for that, but they still need those wet, cold winters for irrigation. And often when we go into the summer, especially with new established plants, we'll need irrigation on those as well. So a common oversight we've seen is irrigation never installed because these are native, drought-tolerant plants, so they don't need it, but that's not the case. And then we'll see that the mortality rate is too high and they'll be less than 50% vegetated, which then makes the feature out of compliance. So we'll go in and start talking about some of the common plants that we'll see in our LID features. Again, these are native perennials, emergent plants, rushes, sedges, and bunch grasses, riparian shrubs. They don't always have to be grasses. We have riparian shrubs, trees. Again, the main emphasis is on drought-tolerant species as well. These species have been specifically chosen because of their ability to uptake pollutants. The uptake of pollutants suspended in stormwater has been well studied, and it's really a function of species composition and time. So if we have the correct composition of species, the species that we've chosen for Appendix F, as well as if these features are designed correctly to hold the water, the longer you hold the water, and if you have the correct composition of species, you can uptake up to 90% of pollutants suspended in stormwater in some controlled studies. Now, obviously, these aren't necessarily controlled studies when we have all these LID features throughout the city, but the main point to drill home is these species are very good at intaking pollutants with their deep root systems. And by establishing these, having 50% vegetation and establishing a correct LID feature, we can do a pretty good job of taking out suspended pollutants in stormwater. So one of the most common species you'll see in our features are rushes. Juncus is the species. Commonly, you'll hear saying rushes are round. These are perennial, wetland-specific herbaceous plants. They have very deep root systems, which makes them extremely efficient at intake of pollutants suspended in water. And then the next slide is sedges. Sedges, also very deep root systems. Common saying is sedges have edges. They are perennial, grass-like. It's one of my favorite plants to work with when it comes to restoration because they're very vigorous growers. They grow rhizomatically, so they shoot stems throughout the ground and then pop up new growth above. And they can really, when you're looking for 50% vegetated cover in a feature and you really want dense planting, sedges are a great choice to turn to. Extremely deep root systems that can uptake pollutants and really helps with limiting invasion of species throughout the gaps of bare soil.
Hey, Aaron, when you say invasion of species, you're talking weeds?
Yes, I'm talking about weeds, invasive species, which we'll get into a little bit.
Right.
And then grasses. Perennial grasses are often utilized in LID features as well. Very similar to a sedge, however, they have joints. And And often our native grasses, not all the time, but often they're bunch grasses that have extremely deep root systems. Again, they have been adapted to deal with wet weathers where they can be wet winters. Well, they'll be inundated with water, can live underwater, and then extremely dry, hot summers in clay soils. So incorporating grasses as well is another way to deal with the uptake of pollutants. And for landscapers and maintenance staff, I think this slide can be very helpful just to talk about common invasive species that we'll be seeing around our region. And these species are prominent all throughout. Harding grass is extremely invasive. And you'll see the other grasses. We have slender oat and Italian rye and ripgut brome and foxtail. Those are also invasive, but their main issue that I have is that they have very shallow root systems. These are annual grasses, so they don't tap into the soil as well. They can lead to erosion. They turn brown. They don't intake pollutants nearly as well. And then you'll have more broadleaf weeds that we'll see throughout LID features if maintenance isn't consistently being done. Those are things like blackberry. We're all familiar with that. Dock, cocklebur, teasel, field mustard, star thistle, scotch broom, and ox tongue. And we'll just go through and just kind of show some pictures of these for everyone to become familiar with them. We've all seen them. We all walk by them every day. So just to show them for you all.
So when we're inspecting, these are the species we do not want to see in the features and that we want to see actually maintained by the owner going forward, which is also why it's important for the 50% vegetative cover to hopefully discourage the propagation of these weeds.
Aaron,
Yes.
to add on one more point to that, those weeds do tend to die off and dry up and die off during the summer season as they are annual, and they tend to clog the storm drains, creating localized flooding. So that's
Absolutely.
another issue with these.
That's a really good point, Flannery. And on that as well, as opposed to native perennials, which will stay green throughout the year, as these die off, that creates a fire hazard as well. And again, we've already talked about how we have these LID features in schools, in parking lots, and near houses. So it's another factor to weigh into why we don't want these species in our LID features. So here's pictures of harding grass and slender oat, ripgut brome, and foxtail. Again, we've seen all of these plants every day. Curly dock, that's a wetland specific plant. You'll see it by that rusty color of the seeds. If you ever drive out into the Laguna or anywhere in the Santa Rosa Plain where you'll see open fields, you can read the topography, or at least the microtopography, by looking at this plant. You'll see these little patches of rusty red out into the landscape, and that shows you where there might be a clay pan or a low depression that holds water a little longer. So obviously we have bioretention features that are meant to divert stormwater and hold them. So we'll see curly dock growing in those. Teasel as well, it acts pretty similar to dock, where it'll be in wetland specific areas, and it likes to stay in those moist areas. So we'll see that in our features as well. And then just like with our plants that are desired, we have low zones and high zones, meaning we have plants that want to be inundated with water, and we have plants that want to be a little bit higher up. Same thing with invasives. We'll see Scotch broom sometimes in features kind of in the higher areas that don't necessarily hold water nearly as long. Bristly ox tongue as well, we'll find that invading our features too.
And so if you do find these features too, we just want to remind you that you're working in an engineered system. So you want to be careful about how you go about eradicating these species. And we'll talk about that later on here. But just again, to kind of repeat a little bit, these should be hand-picked. We don't want uses of insecticides or weed abatement herbicides to abate these types of invasive species. That actually has a potential water quality impairment, that needs to be thought about as you're working around these features. So the landscapers here, when you see these, it's easier to get ahead of it as you see it start to come up versus letting it get established and then trying to address it.
Absolutely. And we'll get into it a little bit more, but it seems like we're kind of going there organically. But you'll see these species start to germinate, and they'll just have their first true leaves, and you'll just see a lot of green inside of a feature, and you'll go, wow, this is very heavily vegetated. And if you're not maintaining your features correctly and doing your routine maintenance, you'll find that come springtime, when these start to flower, you'll go, oh my goodness, we do not have 50% desired vegetation. And that's where a lot more work will come on the back end, rather than just maintaining these in the first place.
So again, just talking about the engineered feature and what goes into it, because you guys are looking at the surface and looking at how pretty it is, but also it's just as important what's below the surface. And here up in the North Coast, we have a lot of clay pan, especially here in Santa Rosa. And these features actually have soil amendments that are engineered. These are designed to allow for that infiltration and also to promote that plant growth. And so this is actually a recipe. For the contractors out there, I usually like to just refer this to you similar to fire caulking, right? Fire caulking, you have to have a very specific recipe when you put it in, and you can't deviate from that. It's the same here with the soil medium. This is where your designer, your geotechnical soil engineer or civil engineer may specify a certain soil type to be put in. These are all things that we're looking for. For those of you that are maintaining it, the landscapers, you need to be aware of whatever you put in here as a soil amendment, or when you go in there and you start altering or replacing plants, that you recognize that there is actually an engineered soil medium below the surface there. So we really wanted just to highlight that, is that you have to follow the recipe. You may need to go back into those design details to get at what that recipe is, so that you get the right material for the right feature. And I will tell you that typically for the city of Santa Rosa, we actually will require the engineer of record to provide documentation that the stormwater treatment systems were built in conformance with the current approved plans and specifications. So this is an important component of that. That's why we're requiring it, but just something to be aware of. For the contractors out there, realize that you are putting, engineered soil in that follows a recipe. So if you put it in too early, you're going to need to protect it. Because again, it's one of the things that we're finding as a common issue, especially during punch list phase. And we'll have some slides later on to show this. But, if you use that feature as a detention basin, which you shouldn't be, you can start to influence the design intent of this soil. I think we want to go into now and talk about some of our priority LID features.
Yeah, so let's get into it now and start really digging in to these priority features. And we'll start out with vegetated bioretention planters. You'll hear, especially in other regions, you'll hear other terms such as rain gardens or bioretention cells, but it can get a little bit convoluted because it can be region specific. But for this case, we're going to be calling these features, we're going to be looking at vegetated bioretention planters. And you'll see these roads along roadsides, in front yards or planter strips. In this case, it's in a parking lot. It's one of the most versatile styles of LID features, and is, I would say, at least in the city of Santa Rosa, is probably the common, if not one of the most common features installed to achieve LID. They're small scale, often with native perennial vegetation. Curb cuts are typically what's used, although we'll see porous concrete gutter pans used as well to allow water to infiltrate. And again, with the high flow bypass, storms will go through when it's larger than a 1-inch event. And we can start moving in and really looking at these features and just starting to get people more familiar with them. So here's a detail of a vegetated bioretention planter. This one's from Clean Water Services, but I think it serves well just to show again the idea of impervious surfaces and waters directed from those tributaries into a bioretention planter, interacts with the vegetation. And as Nick was talking about, these are specific recipes for the soil and soil amendments to allow for infiltration into the groundwater.
Hey, Aaron,
Yes.
Jared has a question. Do you have any any recommended specifications for bioretention soil mix?
I myself don't, as someone who is designing these. Yeah, I don't. Nick, do you have anything to say on that?
You know, in all honesty, that's not really our expertise in the city.
Yeah.
And that's where we're leaning on the geotech or the design engineer. And really, we're following those recipes to a T when we're inspecting. So that's why it's really important for the design community to get the right people involved with the project for those type of soil amendments. I wish I had more information for you on that, but that's really, you need to find the right specialty to figure that out for yourself.
Yeah, and I see people in chat giving some good answers. So
Yeah, hey, Aaron, do you see the question from Aaron McDonald?
no, I do not.
She's asking, would you ever approve a bioretention planter with a utility, water or sewer beneath?
Kevin, this is Flannery. I can take that one if you want,
Yeah.
Aaron.
Go ahead, Flannery.
We reject those due to concerns about the infiltrated water. The whole intent is that the water infiltrates. So we don't want water to be continuously getting into those trench beddings. We do allow them in fairly close proximity within the 5 to 10 foot, the building setback envelope, but we then require the installation of the moisture blocking fabric just as we would around foundations. So that's the stance that the city of Santa Rosa has been taking.
I'd like to jump in as well. This is Yosh Chiles with the County of Sonoma to say that, you know, this is an important question from a maintenance perspective as well. Once you install a utility inside your bioretention facility, and now you have to maintain the utility, now you have to dig up your bioretention facility. And so from a maintenance perspective, that is not something that we would accept and want to see.
Thank you, Yosh. And thank you, Flannery.
The other thing I wanted to add is in the LID manual, the city of Santa Rosa, someone mentioned in the chat here, the BASMA has a soil specification. The manual also has, I believe, for structural soil specification. Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's in the back of the manual, was and is still. And we see structural soil being used. Otherwise, we do ask the engineers to provide documentation of the material that you will be used during construction. That is the intent of the manual, is to make sure that, yeah, we know change orders will occur, things, unexpected things will happen in the field. But if we follow the manual as much as we can, we will put out the best product and then changes can be addressed later.
Yeah.
Okay, and Aaron, real quick, for Jared, Brianna Morrison said places like Soil Plus offer bioretention soil mixes. And
Yes.
then I got another question. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are, but the question is, do these bioretention planters eliminate oils from vehicles?
So that's a good question. It's kind of a yes and no question. There have been studies to show that plants have the ability to uptake these pollutants, but it's not at a scale where you can just plan on having an extremely dirty parking lot that's just pushing oil and petroleum products into your feature nonstop, because then there's a tipping point to where you'll kill your vegetation and be below 50%, and now you're not going to have a successful feature. So they're able to, but it's always to a certain extent.
Yeah, I want to be really clear here that these are not to be your primary treatment for oil spills. We would require and hold you accountable, at least in the city of Santa Rosa, for any spill on the surface to be absorbed and cleaned up. You know, obviously, if there's incidental oil that comes into these are going to help address that, but these are not meant to be primary treatment for those types of issues, even including sediment. Yes, they do get into the feature, but if there's a spill on site, the feature is really your ancillary protection, not your primary protection. we want to see that these companies who have these installed also have a spill prevention program as well too. So, this isn't an end all be all that you can just forget everything that's dropped in your parking lot just because it's going to get treated. Just I want to
Absolutely.
put that out there. Just landscapers as well. A lot of times we see landscapers pushing things around or pushing things into. That's not the intent here. The intent is that everything on the hardscape is manually picked up to try to prevent it from coming into these features. But if it does, then we've got the treatment component here.
Yeah.
And then
Sorry,
Aaron,
go for Kevin.
Aaron, Nick, one other, I guess, question comes in related is, does that soil specification have the infiltration rate value K that's entered into the LID calculator under a BMP sizing tool 100% treatment?
Aaron, do you want to talk about that technical part?
Actually, let's wait a second. Kevin,
okay.
Can we table that and bring that to the Q&A, please?
Yes,
Yeah,
I
good
will.
one to talk
Okay.
about, yeah.
Okay.
I guess getting back to the bioretention planters, and we can kind of segue off of the oil question. You'll see here, this is along a parking lot, and you can see oil staining. Obviously, all of our vehicles to some extent are dripping right now. These bioretention planters are effective in cleaning that amount of oil that we're seeing suspended in stormwater runoff. Again, what kind of going off what Nick was saying, though, you don't want to lean on these as you have a big oil spill to just get a hose and flush it into that curb cut and say, okay, it's in the LID feature, we're fine. But they are effective in cleaning oil suspended in stormwater as well as other pollutants. And this is just a really good example of a feature that I wanted to show. You'll see a nice clean curb. The curb cut's unobstructed. Vegetation is well above 50% threshold. And I just do want to kind of explain that I think these are very aesthetically pleasing. These are really pretty features that can really improve property and make them look great. So it's not just the treatment and the volume capture. These are features that, if done correctly and maintained, will make areas look beautiful. And again, here is the same property, but just a different side of the feature. And we're actually in the next few slides, we'll kind of zoom out and pop into the air and look down on this project and see how it's functioning. But again, thriving vegetation where the parking lot, it has curb cuts and rock dissipators to allow the water to infiltrate. It'll run through that vegetation. And in the bottom middle-ish of that picture, you'll see the high flow bypass where water will discharge. So here is the project itself. There is a pervious surface grass vacant lot, and now it's been developed into a parking lot. And the way this project was designed with this tributary is to allow water to flow down into curb cuts and then enter into that bioretention planter, and water interacts with the vegetation and slowly flows towards the high flow bypass.
Here's just another example of what you see. And again, this is probably more intended not for you design engineers, but for your contractors, for the contractors out there, for the inspectors out there, for the landscapers out there, is that if you see a curb cut, most likely that's leading to an LID feature. So the water is designed to actually flow into these features, get infiltrated, get treated, and then there's a high flow bypass that allows it to get into the storm drain system if it's needed. You tend to see these in new housing developments. Our current manual requires that these roadside bioretention features actually go to an HOA, which makes it a little bit easier for us from the legal aspect and the maintenance declarations to hold them accountable to it. And the HOA is just one of the solutions, but what we're trying to do is to prevent the responsibility going from 15 different homeowners to one responsible party. And again, you're going to see these around the city, especially in new housing developments and apartment complexes. The one thing I wanted to point out with this as well too, in the 2016 order, biofiltration BMPs with an underdrain were required to be sized to treat the first 1.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour storm event. And that increase from the standard design storm by a factor of 1.5 was based on findings in Ventura County. And so again, I just want to tell you part of the iterative process of the permit is that we're learning as we go. We're learning from other regions throughout the state and their different climates and how these features are functioning. But these are the things to watch out for and to look for in new iterations and versions of new manuals that come out. And again, when those do, we will flag those for you. But I just want to kind of point out that this is some of the design components that have changed recently in the last 5 years. The other thing is too, just on this slide really quick, is one of the common issues that we see, you can start to see it here, is that sometimes you start to get some plant growth or some weeds here that start to restrict flow. If you think about water and runoff, it's going to take the path of least resistance. We want to allow the water to come into these features. Sometimes you will see that sometimes the soil media or a base here is a little bit too high. So it doesn't really allow for that infiltration. Sometimes you'll see that these end up getting clogged. Sometimes you'll see that they put these plants right at the inlet. Those are things that we don't really want to see. We want to allow that water to come in and get treated. So just make sure those are things that you're keeping in mind as you're installing these features and as you're maintaining these features. Sometimes it's going to just a matter of having a pre-job meeting with your landscaper to make sure that they understand what this is doing and where to appropriately put those plants. Or for your design engineers of maybe calling that out to make sure that they're staggered appropriately to keep those open. Again, we're just showing these that they come in all different shapes and sizes. The water is going to come through this curb cut into that infiltration media. And then it has that high flow drop inlet just in case we get an event that's over the design 1-inch storm event. But some of the benefits of these features are that they do help restore the watershed's natural hydraulic process by mitigating the impacts of pavement and other impervious surfaces. And they're filtering the pollutants that are coming off of here. You can see we've got some sedimentation issues, but if that gets into this feature, that's helping to reduce that sediment from getting into our storm drain system, which is ultimately an extension of our creeks. It's reducing that peak flow, reducing erosion. It's helping to infiltrate that water to restore our groundwater tables. It's providing habitat. It's reducing urban heat island effect. In some cases, these features will provide shade. Really, again, if these are done right, they may actually help with some aesthetics and some property values as well, too. So there is a lot of benefits that come from these LID features. And it's real easy for us to look at these and going, man, what a pain. And we have to keep, we have to maintain these. But if done right, there actually is tremendous value in having these features within our urban environments.
Okay, hey, Nick and Aaron got a question for Jesus. He says, for these examples, which priority do they fall under in the BMP selection table, or which LID detail can we use as reference?
I believe these are priority 1 because they're bioretention planters. I don't know the details off the top of my head, but in the appendices in the LID manual, there are references, I think, to a couple different reference standards.
Can I jump in for a moment, Nick?
Yep, go ahead.
This is Josh with the County of Sonoma. In my answer to the initial question, I tried to kind of give the concept of this, of priority BMPs. The highest priority BMP actually are the ones that, priority 1 BMP would be the one with no unperforated pipe. Like you see here, I don't know what's underneath the ground right here. But if there's no perforated pipe and all the stormwater is allowed to infiltrate, and this is a one facility, that's priority 1. Once you install the pipe, the perforated pipe, now you're limiting the volume capture. Now one priority down, that's a priority 2. Priority 3 is if you're breaking up the BMP. The word treatment train came up earlier. We want to make sure we know what we're saying when we say treatment train, the concept of LID. But that is a lower priority because now you have two components to the BMP. And in order for the BMP to provide both treatment and retaining the runoff to achieve the requirements, both components must operate. If one breaks down, the BMP is not an LID BMP anymore. Now you can see why this is considered a lower priority BMP. Further, there are pre-manufactured BMP. We have companies out there, I believe there may be some on the call today, that offer these type of facilities. Those are pre-manufactured with a make and model that you can go and buy. And those are the lowest priority BMPs. And those that do require approvals sometimes, we need to look at them. Those are not specified in the manual. So that is the priority, I think, that we want to conceptually go through. Going back to the details that are in the manual, they are designated by the priority. P1 is always priority 1. P2 is priority 2. P3 is priority 3. And they have names associated with it. We don't need to get into the names. Earlier, it was talked about, do I have to use the exact detail? The details are in the manual for that reason, because we are all educating ourselves on how these things operate. And that manual puts details that are based on experience. So if you go and change that detail based on your engineering experience, that's why we all need to look at it. That's the concept of priority BMPs.
Great, thanks, Joash.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Joash.
that.
That's a good answer. And yeah, in getting back to the question of, these are priority features, whether they're priority 1, 2, or 3 or not. It's hard to see it again, just from looking at this photo. It really depends on whether you have perforated pipe infrastructure or if these are standalone.
So moving on here, one of the things that we do want to see, that we do like to see, is these rock dissipators. You know, the one thing I would point out here that I don't really care about is that it's got this pervious or impervious surface here. It is reducing flow, but the cobbles on their own would actually probably be better for this feature. But we do like to see that energy dissipation here, which would prevent any reeling or erosion from the water flowing into this feature. But things that we're looking for when we're inspecting is we do want to make sure that these inlets in these bioretention planters are allowing the water to flow, and that any issues from the water being allowed in there are being addressed. Obviously, we'd be looking for 50% vegetation. We'd be looking at the mulch here, which looks like it could be a floatable mulch, which might be an issue. And then we'd also be looking at potential interferences, if you can see up here, in that feature, but things that you might want to look for during the inspection process or even during the maintenance process here.
Hey, Nick, can I add one thing? This is Elizabeth. So this is an area that we've seen a lot in Windsor, where we've had some troubles with this, where this stone is in that rock pad. Sometimes we really want that, and we want the concrete because of the liners. We need to get past those liners. And so if we don't have something like this, sometimes the water will come in and get behind the liner, and we don't want that to happen. So we require these to make sure it gets into the swale and that it doesn't infiltrate on the other side of the liner. So I know you say the concrete isn't good all the time, but sometimes it's really necessary, and we definitely want to make sure that it gets all the way into the bioswale. Sometimes the curb cut is 10 feet from the actual swale, so we want to make sure it gets right into the middle of that swale so it can infiltrate.
Yeah, I appreciate the context on that, Elizabeth.
Thanks.
And so you will see nuances too between the different cities and what we've seen and experienced. And sometimes this is just a matter of when we came out to inspect it too. I think those are great points. And I think it is important to know that there is a liner here on the edge here. And I think we've got some pictures coming up that'll actually show that liner.
And Nick, if I could interject for just 1 second, this is Heaven with the regional board. I just wanted to point out, I think we've touched on some really good points here too, but, and I put it in the chat, but I wanted to make sure too, another really important component of this And sometimes this can get lost in translation between the design, the construction contractor, and then the landscaper, either and even between landscape installation and then maintenance, which is just that these are going to look a little bit different, and the small changes in grade and elevation are really important to ensure their function. So, looking at and ensuring that the flow path isn't short-circuited by overfilling with mulch or material, or trying to, make it flat or make it deeper or make it look different, that those nuances are important. Sometimes, you could have a footprint that's out here, but you effectively short-circuit it to be this big unintentionally, kind of through those landscape installations or maintenance practices. And so I think that kind of relates to what Elizabeth was saying too, is making sure it gets to where it's supposed to be going. So I just bring that up for the benefit of some of the people on the line that might be on that installation and maintenance side specifically, to make sure we keep our flow paths open, we aren't short-circuiting the kind of footprint, if you will, of where the stormwater is intended to be as part of the feature.
I would also kind of point out too that this might influence your calculation too.
Yeah.
Just something to be aware of, and you're going to want to make sure that that's in part of your design and part of your calculation there.
Yeah, and it's easy to say, oh, okay, I'm going to count everything in the calculation when I started all the way up to the back of the curb as it's shown here. But if water isn't actually coming up to that point, or if you're not thinking about those elevation changes within that feature, you could effectively have a smaller footprint than you intended.
Great, thanks, Heaven.
Yeah.
So again, you're just going to see different, these features designed in different ways. This just doesn't have the curb. It's allowing water to sheet flow off of the parking lot into these features to be treated. Again, just kind of showing that these come in all different shapes and sizes. Wanted to throw this in here. Something to be aware of is just making sure that these features mid-construction are protected. It's extremely important. Again, there's a structural soil base here that needs to be protected. You've got overflow inlet pipes, and many of these features might have this impermeable liner on there on the sides. And so you want to make sure that that doesn't get ripped or damaged or destroyed. But things that we look for during the construction process and part of the sequencing of construction of these features, because ultimately it does impact ownership and functionality of this beyond the construction phase. Depending on the municipality that you're working in, or depending on kind of what you introduce into your feature during construction, you might be required to do a functional test on it. And I just wanted to show this picture because, one, I wanted to show you that it was possible. And two, I just thought this was a great picture in essence of how these features function. And the water comes in there. There is a perforated pipe, it looks like on this one. And eventually, once the water table comes up to a certain level, it infiltrates into that perforated pipe and then right out directly into the storm drain system, hopefully treated. So, these are things to be aware of as you're installing these, and things to if you had a question of whether it was going to function correctly or not, that potentially you could consider doing while you're constructing these features, or even afterwards if you needed to show us that it actually was functioning and being maintained. There is a way to do that.
Sorry, I'm gonna
go ahead.
You're probably going to show it in your next slide, but I just want to really emphasize this. These BMPs that we're talking about today are not, are distinct and completely separate from construction BMPs, and they should not and cannot function to control the loading off of a construction site. They're super sensitive, they can plug, they're really meant for the loading off of a paved and completed project, in perpetuity forward from the completion of the project. So it's easy, I think, to forget that they are a BMP. We think about other BMPs during construction that deal with sediment and erosion control. These are unique and distinct and very different. So I just want to stress that for our contractors, designers that are doing construction inspection, and anyone working in the field.
I got you covered, Heaven.
Cool.
You ready for it? Here it comes.
You must have seen our presentation, Heather.
Sorry, I should have waited.
You're totally good. So let's talk about mid-construction issues, right? You know, a lot of times you're doing construction in phases. You want to sell homes. You want the landscape features in there so you can sell and have people occupy. Sometimes that's to the greatest detriment of these features. We do not want to see these areas getting compacted. We do not want to see these areas being used as detention basins. These do not replace the temporary BMPs that required by just general construction or even the construction general permit for sites that are over an acre. You know, any sedimentation that's allowed to flow into here or sediment and debris potentially could clog or alter that engineered soil, as well as some of the components that go into this engineered feature. Here's a good example that we just had happen recently. It's got some great protections around this during construction, but the problem is that the storm drain is tied into it. And the construction site accepted a bunch of sediment from the project into the storm drain system, which flows to these features. And if you look closely, you can kind of see that this area is starting to get mucked up. You know, this is a soil that who knows may now prevent water from infiltrating into it. We've got some undermining under the silt fence here. We've got some erosion coming down on the sides. These are all things that we're looking for during construction and that we're considering during punch list of whether or not we're going to accept or not, and whether or not it's reasonable for an owner to accept this from a contractor. You know, again, you just need to watch out for the water surface flowing. If you're going to have these features available, you really need to consider whether or not they should be accepting runoff from the construction site, or whether or not that feature needs to be temporarily plugged during the construction activities. Again, just things to look out for during construction or even after construction is how are these functioning during a rainstorm? We shouldn't see this. This has a high flow bypass, but the interesting thing about this particular picture is that the high flow bypass is too high. So what's happening here is that the water is being pushed back out through the pipe that's discharging here, and it's clogging up the catch basin that's adjacent to it and coming out into the city street. So again, how these are designed and the elevations are things to watch out during construction, but also to be mindful of after you have a design storm event. Go look at your feature after it's been installed to make sure that it's performing accordingly. And again, we do not want to see these used as detention ponds during construction. This is exactly what we're trying to avoid.
Nick, this is Elizabeth again.
Yep.
One other thing is sometimes we'll see these overflow bypasses that are way too low too, that they're like in line with the soil and that they are not actually filling it up before they overflow. So that's another thing to pay attention to, because we've had to have contractors actually pull these things out, and that is no fun once it's been constructed. So something very important to pay attention to.
You know, and some of this too is just looking at the elevations of the soil when you do projects like this too, and just making sure that you're following the design intent. It's really easy to kind of let this get away from you, and sometimes these issues aren't really figured out until after construction, which creates bigger issues.
And then I'd like to add, if I may, Nick, that
Real quick, because we're running out of time here, Yoash.
Okay, then let's move forward, please.
So mid-construction issues, again, you know, you can kind of see some of the issues in the mucking that's going on. The silt layer is now altering the infiltration rates. It's increasing turbidity. And our runoff is, once it goes into the high flow bypass, is going right into our stormwater system. You know, during construction, we will require these features to be reinstalled. And again, it puts the design professional on the hook when he has to provide, or he or she has to provide certifications that this is designed in accordance to the standards. So again, this is all stuff just to kind of show you that you can actually take on a lot more than what you intended, and you're doing twice the work at twice the cost.
So getting out of construction issues and now into fully installed features, let's go ahead and look at Coffee Park, which where LID features were constructed post 2017 fire when they redid the park. And red highlighted shows the bioretention features which are installed into the park. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see that it's no coincidence that they placed these features directly at the drop inlets of the storm drain system, which runs beneath the park, to treat that water before it enters those inlets. And you'll see here, here is a bioretention planter at the inlet inside of the park itself. You'll see juncus planted on the outside, and then field sedge, carex planted in the inside, and hopefully that'll spread over time. You know, as an inspector of features, when I look at this and I see it, I'd like to see it more filled in and have more thriving vegetation, but it wouldn't quite alarm me knowing that this is a relatively new feature and they are going to fill in over time. So again, we want that 50% vegetation. You don't want to see as much bare soil as we see here, but maintenance has been pretty fantastic on this feature because you don't see any weeds or invasive species growing in between our desired plants. Here's another one in the park. This one receives water through sheet flow of the playground and the pathways which go around it. So water flows off of that surface and then is discharged or it then infiltrates the soil while interacting with the vegetation. Again, you'll see the high flow bypass down there, and you can see the structural soil as well. You'll see that grayish soil. So the mulch is on top, and then you'll see the gray soil. And I think this is a good time to talk about mulch itself and how we want, we're looking for interlocking mulch, not that fine kind of playground landscape mulch that you'll see where it's a lot of small pieces. We find that can create floatables inside of our features and float and go into the high flow bypass. It can clog up the storm drain systems. Mulch is a great tool to decrease your maintenance activities in terms of dealing with invasive species, but the correct mulch is just as important. And having that interlocking mulch, it's kind of ground up a little bit larger and is able to interlock and not float nearly as much.
So just some things to look for in these types of features. Aaron, do you want to just, I'll let you start out this off here.
Yeah, so you know, they come in all shapes and sizes. Again, here's a curb cut, and this one's along the parking lot. Rather than being extremely grass dependent, this one has quite a few native roses growing through the middle, as well as juncus, and then you'll see black walnut. It's important to note for contractors and landscapers that when we talk about 50% vegetation, we're talking about herbaceous vegetation and shrubs. We're not talking about trees. So you can have plenty of trees growing through your bioretention planters, but it's really those herbaceous species that we want to see at 50%. That's where we really get our intake in pollutants as opposed to trees and woody species.
Aaron, this is Brendan.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Jared, and he has a good question. He said he has seen bioretention sod being advertised. And is that an appropriate type of vegetation for bioretention?
I would say that, well, we can always, it depends on the species, obviously. We don't want an invasive species like an annual grass sod being used. So we have our Appendix F where we can reference in terms of the grassy species that we want. And I put it in the chat that if you do have species that you want to implement that aren't in Appendix F, we want to be as flexible as we can with landscapers and contractors to a certain extent. We understand that it might be difficult to find certain species or you want to incorporate something else. You can always contact the Regional Water Quality Control Board to get an amendment to those species, but we really want to stay away from, you know, for instance, this bioretention sod. I don't know what it is, but if it's an annual grass, then we would not accept that. If it was a bioretention sod that was some sort of perennial field sedge or something, then that would be acceptable, absolutely. So I'm not sure what this species composition is, but it would have to be something that we would look at.
And just to add to that really quickly, I've seen it planted a bunch of places. I'm not sure on the species list, but I have noticed that it tends to die out in the lowest zones. So it's just something to kind of have an eye on, that the areas by the drains tend to always just sort of die out, and they take a lot of irrigation relatively.
Good point, Kellen.
Great. So just some of the other things that we would look for in the bioretention planters is you want to just be mindful of where the water is coming into these features. You can see the curb cut and the sheet flow from the impervious parking lot here, or surface from the parking lot. You know, you want to check that overflow drop inlet, make sure that it's free and can accept that high flow bypass. But you also should just be aware, just because it's green does not mean it's okay. Be aware of, you know, the dense mix of invasive species in here and what is approved. And this is where the maintenance, annual maintenance really comes in. And this is where our inspections come in to really make sure that these things are in conformance with the intent of these features. So, you know, those are, just because it's green doesn't mean it's getting the filtering that it needs. And it's also, we don't want to see the invasive species in here, because ultimately when those start to broadcast seeds, you start to propagate those into our nearby streams and creeks. You know, so it's really, we really want to see these maintained and things that we're looking for when we're inspecting.
Yeah, and kind of going off that, here's this feature here. And it's green, but is it what we want? Is that the vegetation we're looking for? You know, we also see bare exposed soil in some places. The arrow is pointing at the high flow bypass, which you can't see. It's completely choked out by these invasives. And really, this is what you get from a result of lack of routine maintenance. Things can compound to where you can, if you're not dealing with it consistently, because these are living, breathing features, right? And they need consistent maintenance. It doesn't mean a lot of maintenance in terms of time, but it needs consistent maintenance. And when you don't do that and you're not conducting routine maintenance, you can get something like this where this feature needs to essentially be completely reconfigured.
And what I would say is that you just need to understand where these features are on your property. You can see how quickly these would get away from you, and then you're not going to recognize it as an LID feature. Now it just looks like just a standard strip of grass that's overgrown, and really just understanding where these are and what the intent is, and making sure that if you switch landscape contractors or just even maintenance personnel for a municipality, just make sure that everybody who's involved with the project understands what they're protecting and why.
Yeah, and you'll see this is in the same location. Features have gotten away from them. Completely overgrown with invasive species, and again, the inlet is totally blocked. You know, and you know that kind of raises the question, and we've talked about it a bit. You know, why does it even matter if all we want is a well-vegetated feature, and we keep harping on well-vegetated? And if these invasive species want to be here, we're keeping it well-vegetated. Surely they're uptaking some sort of pollutants, right? So why do we really want native grasses? And I think this is a really good visual to show you. Both sections of this cross section dug out, they're planted to full capacity. And on one side is a native perennial grass, on the other side is an annual grass. And you can see the root system. It's just night and day. And I think this is a really good visual to give to people to show how much you can allow water to infiltrate into these vegetated features compared to something with a very shallow root system. And also these plants, we've talked about it a little bit before, but these native grasses, they're adapted for our climate and they're going to stay green. That decreases fire risk, that decreases dying off in the summer and clogging our high flow bypasses. So we really want to stress having the correct vegetation in these features. So here is an overlook, an aerial of that feature. And again, just kind of getting over the point that we need routine maintenance and how quickly these can get away. So this is 5 years and it looks relatively new in 2015. I would say the vegetation isn't quite there. They probably planted with it, planning to fill in and grow. So that's young vegetation in 2015. And you see in 2020, there's no way you can really call out where that feature was supposed to be. In the next slide, you'll see the exact same thing. Here's another feature. And then you see it get away in 2020. Just really harping that, LID requires ongoing annual maintenance. And again, these are living, breathing features. These are an extension of our storm drain system, but rather than a catch basin or an inlet, they're living and they're breathing, and they need to be tended to. And just pushing the point as well that as the owner of these features, that continual annual maintenance, that's a small lift. We're not talking about huge things. It's really just hand picking some weeds, making sure the inlet or curb cut is unimpeded. That's literally just sweeping away the sediment with a shovel and throwing it away, and you're good to go. So continually maintaining these features, it's not that big of a lift at all. But if you ignore over time, that's going to be a huge monetary lift, huge time lift. So stay on top of these features.
Okay, we're up for question 4. Elizabeth, do you want to put it up? Okay, if you want to take 30 seconds to respond. And a few more seconds.
Yeah, we'll give it a few more. We're only at 60%.
Okay.
What's the plan for having a short break? Feel about due for that?
Yeah, so everyone will, after this, we'll have a little response to question 4 from Yoash, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. And what I'll also let you know is looking at the time and where we're at in the presentation, there's a chance we'll go past 11. We will stay on and finish it, and we'll stay on to answer questions you've already asked in the chat and any other questions you might have as well. So if you can stay on after 11, please do so. What I would say is that if you can't and you have questions, put in the chat, and we'll try to draft up responses and send them out to everyone.
Okay, I'll end the poll now.
Okay, Yoash, you wanna take this one?
Thank you, Kevin. I just want to address, there was a funny answer in there that read, can cover trash cans, and most of you answered 1%. And I just want to flip that concept around regarding and LID BMPs that function as approved and permitted account for trash capture. Trash capture is defined as capture of all trash and debris 100 microns in diameter for LID BMPs and larger. The trash amendment now requires that all debris particles 5 millimeters or approximately 0.2 inches or greater in size must be tracked to meet the full captured standard. Bioretention facilities satisfy the requirement above as long as maintained. Other mechanisms to remove the coarser trash include, but not limited to, trash capture devices installed in existing or proposed drainage inlets and vegetated swales. Regardless of the mechanism chosen to remove the trash, all require maintenance and are covered under the maintenance agreement. Another example, a pervious gutter, which if not maintained, the pore spaces may clog over time, inhibiting the 1 inch of runoff from reaching the treatment and volume capture component of the post-construction BMP. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, I guess we're going to take a 5-minute break. I'll set the timer. It looks like it's 10:07, so we'll come back at 10:12.
Aaron, I think we could probably make up some time on these last slides.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Morning, Joe.
How you guys doing so far? It looks like you got a, I was scrolling through the gallery when I first logged in. It looks like you got a really good turnout.
Yeah,
it's
no, I think it's
nice.
a great turnout.
Yeah, that's great.
We have 115 participants right now.
That's great. Almost as many as were at the Sebastopol City Council meeting last night to voice their opposition to the proposed homeless camp up at the north end of town. That was thrilling.
Wow. How many do you normally have at your meetings?
We might draw maybe 30 or 40, depending on what's on the agenda. You know, the open public comment is always interesting at a Sebastopol City Council meeting. We had one gentleman last night, we don't know who he was. He signed into Zoom with the screen name of James Bond. And he asked to speak on the issue. And so when they finally came around to him, rather than speaking, he started playing one of the theme songs from the James Bond movies.
Wow.
I don't know what he had in mind with that, other than to just be unusual. There's
We'll blame it
a lot
on
of
COVID.
unusual people in Sebastopol, you know?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, I think I'll miss all that. Probably not.
Yeah, homelessness is a tough one these days. We're seeing
Yeah.
it pop up all over the place. It's even kind of creeping into Katati a little bit.
Yeah,
Change.
it's tough to balance compassion with the neighbors' needs to keep their neighborhood clean and secure.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that's a-
Okay. Oh, sorry about that, Joe. It's 10:12. Just because we're sort of short on time, we're going to go ahead and get started. So Nick and Aaron, do you want to take it away?
Yep. Hey, and Kevin, let's hold questions to the end at this point. If you can just maybe track those.
Yes.
And I think these last little bit, we should, Aaron and I should be able to jam through.
Okay.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to kind of get into now some of the maintenance requirements here. And one of the things that I really wanted to talk about, especially for the design professionals, is that what we see often happen in your final LID submittals is you're copying pages from the LID manual, which is great, but it's a guidance document. And really, depending on who's going to own these features, you know, I would recommend trying to give some information that's going to give the owner a fighting chance to maintain these. Most of this is common sense and pretty practical, but it's interesting. These are common issues that we would find in these bioretention features, such as the sedimentation issues, and really just kind of looking for the blockages there and cleaning them out, dealing with standing water, making sure that that water drains after 72 hours, you know, and making sure that we're inspecting the inlets and outlets, looking for soil compaction issues, you know, removing debris from those outlets, things that are just really just take someone to go over and actually look at the feature and do it periodically to make sure that we don't start to get a cumulative problem. You know, how are the plants surviving? And is replanting necessary? Is watering necessary, especially during these last 2 years of significant drought? Those are all things we're starting to notice in our inspections. You know, we're looking at the invasive species. We're looking if weeds are taking over, and just having owners and landscapers just understand that those need to be removed. And you know, there's going to be some seasonal variations in there as well too. And again, just like Yoash shared, is that we have a trash amendment that's requires us to comply with by 2030, and these features do capture trash. And so just making sure that whatever is captured in that feature, that debris and that trash is removed on a routine basis, and obviously more frequently in wet weather, because that's really what's conveying that trash into the storm drain system. So wanted to kind of just open this up to see kind of what you guys see wrong, and just for spirit of time, I think I'm just gonna kind of jam through, but hopefully you're answering this to yourself while we're doing this presentation. And what I wanted to share with you is, this is something that we learned from that first manual, is that we should have vegetation here. Really what we have is a lot of lack of vegetation. There's some sediment here that, you know, really maybe at best we're slowing this down and maybe infiltrating it, but where's the treatment that comes along here? Now, some of these we've inherited just from previous manuals, and so we're required to keep them maintained. But we really want you to kind of be mindful of, these are the things that we are evolving from and that we're working to address in new iterations of the manual. You know, just things to think about is, where does the water enter? Where is it going to go? Does it allow for any vegetation to interact with that feature? And is there enough vegetation? This one's pretty obvious and pretty straightforward. But again, you know, here at minimum for maintenance, we'd be looking at what kind of sediment has settled between these cobbles, and that may be become part of the annual maintenance requirement, or something that the owner would want to be mindful of. Obviously, we don't want to see bare soil. That we want to see those with plants, and the manuals do address this, and these are not accepted during the construction phase. And again, some of this stuff we've just inherited. In fact, this looks like it's a subdivision that probably intended to put the plants in during development phase and probably got delayed. So we probably have a partial LID feature here. Again, just looking at this, just, you know, be mindful of where the water's flowing in and what's the intent and how's it going to get into that bypass or that storm drain system. Does it allow for enough contact time and treatment and infiltration? So the things that we're looking for here, again, kind of go into that trash amendment, and the requirement is that basically the state by 2030 is requiring that no trash greater than 5 millimeters or greater enters a storm drain system. And what that means is the size of a cigarette butt. You can see all the cigarette butts here. These are all things that we're looking for in our inspections, and things that we would require an owner to address and maintain and take care of. The other thing is too, you just want to look at this path of travel, right? And it's great that it's accepting water in, but at what point does it come in contact with a plant? And do we have any channelization that's happening there that needs to be addressed as part of their annual maintenance? Maybe even need to do a replanting or reestablishment just to address some of those issues to make sure we're getting appropriate treatment for that feature. This feature is obviously doing its job. You can see that. But again, we want to make sure that the path into this feature is unobstructed. We want to make sure that the sediment and debris behind the feature is cleaned up and addressed. And this, as a minimum, needs to be done annually. But if you've got an area that's accepting a lot, high volume of potential pollutants, it may need to be cleaned more frequently. And maybe this is a 6 month prior to rain, after rain, maybe even a seasonal cleaning or review of the feature. The other thing is too, I'd point out the tan bark here. Obviously, we don't want floatables. We don't want them coming into the storm drain system. These are all things that we're looking for when we're inspecting, and things that we would require an owner to address. These are things that we go back into the LID manual and into the construction drawings to show the intent and to show that these were not part of the original feature, and that we'd have an owner maintain as part of their requirements in their maintenance declaration. You know, again, we've got this cobble put in. It looks like it was now cemented in, which now makes this a impervious surface. So was this part of the original design intent? Those are things that we're questioning as inspection staff. We're looking at the sedimentation here and the potential introduction into the drop inlet here, which is part of our storm drain system. These are all things that need to be addressed with routine maintenance and cleaning of these features. And again, we would probably look at this mulch and just to see if that's creating an issue, whether that's floatable or not. These are things that we want to just start to create some awareness about for ownership, and things that we're probably going to be addressing in future manuals as well too. You know, again, asking you what's wrong here, looking at the feature, there's quite a few things. There's a lot of trash buildup here. We've got this drain rock that's obviously doing what it was intended to do, is to capture and settle. But these probably need to be maintained and cleaned out. You know, you've got, it looks like a little bit of a silt fence or a barrier here that's been damaged or just inundated. It probably needs a simple repair on that. And again, we'd be looking for 50% vegetative cover as well too. So again, same thing, what's wrong here? This is pretty self-explanatory, but you know, do they have the right species here according to Appendix F? Do they, the sediment buildup behind this needs to be cleaned out, the cigarette butts and the trash. These are common issues that we find, especially for features that have been around for quite a while. For those of you contractors out there, is make sure you remove your inlet protections. This filter fabric, one, is installed incorrectly. We want to see this over the drop inlet, not under the drop inlet, because as soon as someone lifts this up, now we have all that debris going into our storm drain system. But these are things that we look for as inspectors. You know, we're actually out there looking at every single portion of these features. We've got plan sets in hand. And these are things that are part of your maintenance checklists, and that should be part of your maintenance checklist for each of these features as well too. You know, a good practice is to observe your feature during a design storm event, or even a beyond design storm event to see what's happening. You know, you can't tell, but this feature back here in the back, this is an LID feature. And the question that I would throw out to you is that what is happening with the high flow bypass? Why is this water not draining into that high flow bypass? Is it clogged? Is it not designed correctly? Is it too high? Those are things to start to consider, you know, as you start to see issues develop around your features. Again, this was designed to treat and infiltrate, but we do allow for high flow bypass so that the storm drain system can function as designed to prevent localized flooding, which is not occurring in this scenario.
So now we'll move into just another type of feature, another type of LID BMP, and that's vegetated swales, which are open, shallow channels with vegetation covering the sides and slopes. It functions as a soil and plant-based filtration and infiltration unit, much like many of these other. Yes.
Your sound is kind of cutting in and out. I don't know
Okay.
if anybody else is getting that, but I just wanted to let you know.
Okay, maybe I'll switch to my other headset.
Yeah, you're okay right now. I just, for some reason, it was lowering and raising. So
Okay.
I'll let you know if it happens again, and then you can
Yeah,
switch.
thanks. Really think of these as kind of miniature creeks, but not creeks per se, but kind of a headwater tributary type of channels, vegetated swales per se. They can be utilized in larger areas to hold a lot more stormwater. So if you have a very large tributary, but that doesn't mean they can only be that way. There are areas where we'll see smaller vegetated swales that handle much smaller tributary areas. Here's a diagram just showing the basics of a vegetated swale with the inlet and allowing water to infiltrate and interact with the vegetation. And then you'll have the outlet to where it gets discharged into the MS4. So here is a vegetated swale, and it's grass lined along both sides. It provides filtration and drainage for almost the entire park. We'll see a little bit of incision in something like this, so it'd be important to make sure that we have vegetation all throughout and at the bank or the bottom at the bed of the swale. Nick, if you go to the next slide, I think this is a pretty good visual to show. So you'll see the storm drain system, and highlighted in red is the vegetated swale. And what's really cool about this is this feature is functioning to essentially filter almost all of the park, at least all of the eastern edge of the park and all of the impervious surfaces there. It's a fantastic feature and very well designed to be diverting most of the park stormwater into it. And it's been in great shape. And you'll see just above the feature, what's really cool is there's a concrete lined vegetated, or not vegetated, but a concrete lined swale. So if you go out there, you can really see the difference in how the water interacts in terms of velocity and settling as it hits this LID feature. Here is another vegetated swale, and you can see that parking lot at the bottom. The water runs off of this tributary and is diverted into this vegetated swale. The water interacts with it, flows through, and then eventually goes out into an outlet pipe, which goes subsurface and actually discharged directly into Piner Creek. If you were to pan over that photo, you would see Piner Creek right next to there. So it's great that this tributary is right next to a creek, and instead of directly being diverted into the creek, it's allowed to be treated through this LID feature. Sorry, Nick, you want to take this?
Sure. So some of the maintenance requirements here, obviously, you know, the mow and irrigate during dry weather is pretty self-explanatory, especially for a landscaper. You know, we want to make sure that those outlets are free from obstructions. You know, we want to make sure that water drains within 72 hours. That's a vector control issue. More specifically, for most mosquitoes, it takes 72 hours for them to hatch, which is why the 72-hour requirement is there. We're looking for trash. We're looking at the bank stability. We're looking for erosion, incision. And we really want to make sure that they've got the right practices in place and they're not using fertilizers or pesticides, you know, as practical here. So these are things to look for or to include in your maintenance requirements, and also for landscapers, things to be mindful while you're maintaining them. And just to kind of put it into bigger perspective for you is that here's a graphic for kind of ideally what you might address or how you might create a maintenance plan, depending on the seasonality of that feature and the function of it. You know, removing that excess sediment, looking for weeds and hand removing them as much as possible, you know, replacing plants to make sure that you're within that 50% vegetative cover, you know, using an arbor or vineyard mulch that's less likely to float, you know, looking to do, you know, supplemental irrigation in the dry season as needed. And again, just making sure that that overflow drainage is clean and clear and allowed to function appropriately here as well.
And you'll start to notice that when we get into the maintenance requirements of all these features, we're overlapping with essentially all of the maintenance requirements, because essentially these are all functioning the same way in terms of treating and capturing water. So one of the main things we'll see in terms of maintenance is mowing and keeping mowing limited. Mowing needs to be done to not block, say, a curb cut or an inlet and then the high flow bypass. And often what we'll see when one of the maintenance requirements written in the LID manual is to mow, that's taken too excessively, and vegetated or desired species will be mowed down way too low, and over time you'll start to see mortality of these species, and really they're not interacting with the water nearly as much. So just want to tease that into that, you know, while we're saying mowing these features, it doesn't mean over mowing.
You know, just understanding your features. Aaron's right that, you know, vegetative features all are going to have similar maintenance requirements to them. They might have some slight nuances depending on what they're intended to do. But again, even on the detention basin here, just knowing what is the difference between detention and retention. And detention is that we're allowing that water to hold for a period of time to allow time for treatment and infiltration, and then it slowly discharges into the storm drain system. Whereas retention is more similar to your ponding scenario where you're holding that water in on a more permanent basis with no plan to discharge. But just realize what these systems were designed to do, and then that also is going to determine on how you're going to maintain them as well. You know, quickly again, just because it's a vegetated feature, these are all going to be the same. But you know, when you're out here maintaining them, obviously you want to be aware of animals and insects, and you know, we obviously don't want to have poisonous plants in here, which is probably not as common. But we could see closer to some of our creek settings, just things to be aware of that we would want to keep out of these features. Trash and debris is important to be mindful of, looking for erosion, standing water. Is there any sedimentation issues? You know, the other thing is we want to make sure we've got the desired vegetation here. And again, remembering back to the slide in the beginning of just respecting the zone, is are these plants going to be able to handle that water when it gets infiltrated here in the wet weather? And do we have the right species and the approved species in this feature? Do we have the right quantity? Do we have the right plant establishment? Do these require pruning? And is it over pruned? Is it, you know, not pruned enough? Those are things that from a maintenance perspective that needs to be considered here, that we see as common issues in these features. You know, the other thing is too, just as you're maintaining these features, especially for you landscapers, it's always our owners really, it's really good to document the maintenance that you do, and also to photograph that maintenance that you do. Sometimes that's your best defense, but also kind of tells a greater story when we start to send out compliance letters of how we can come alongside and support you through that. You know, here we just wanted to show a graphic of how some of these are functioning or designed and working. One thing I just point out is that all throughout the state, and even now as LID becomes more prevalent throughout the country, is that some of these features are designed with the same intent in mind, but are called different things. And so just be mindful of that. But here in the North Coast, our LID manual is based on our climate conditions and also our soil types, which are going to be different than Oregon or Washington or even New Orleans or back east. Although those are great examples and things that we're drawing from and can draw from, it's just a much different environment that we're designing these systems to. And I'd even say just even the microclimates in California, San Diego LID manual is going to be much different than ours up here, although some of the basic concepts are there. And one of my hopes is that at some point we get a little more uniform in what we call these things and how we call them. But just wanted to bring attention to that. Again, these are designed to hold and treat water from, this one happens to be from a housing development. But one of the things to be looking for is, where does the water flow into this feature? Where does it flow out? Do we have appropriate vegetation? Is the bank stabilized appropriately? Are we seeing any erosion or rilling or any other additional issues that need to be addressed as part of their annual maintenance? Again, this is just another detention basin and kind of just showing what we look for and what they look like. This one actually happens to be pretty integral because this one goes right into the Russian River. So, sometimes this is your last line of defense before it hits kind of one of our major water bodies that, our community tends to recreate and rely on for water supply. And really the bottom line here is that the comment or the goal that we're really after is fishable, swimmable, drinkable. This is another example of a detention basin and what these can look like from an aerial point. You can see that it's accepting water from the storm drain system here on the north side, and then it's coming out here on the south side treated. And that's really the point of all of this. But again, just understanding where your water is flowing into, it also will help you to maintain that and to look for issues as it comes in, but also as it goes out. This is just a detention basin in dry weather. Some things that you might be mindful of is you've got obviously an invasive plant coming in here, and how is that going to affect the high flow bypass? This might need to be maintained, pruned back, removed, just really kind of understanding these features and how they're working. But then again, it's coming out and inspecting them not only in dry weather, but if possible during a rain event, just to see how they're performing. And you can kind of see the water, how it comes down. This is a really interesting one just because it's coming down the impervious surface and into the detention pond. And again, does this drain within 72 hours? Is it functioning as correctly? Does it need to be, what kind of maintenance is needed here as a result of that? So again, just things that we're looking for in the detention basin in particular is the trash and debris. We don't want to see the invasive species. We want the inlets and outlets removed of any obstructions. Watch out for gopher holes. Those might need to be addressed because ultimately you might be impacting the way that these features are met or engineered and designed to function. You look for, dead or dying or diseased vegetation, and, address the fire risks associated with that as well too. Again, here's just a common one that we would see in looking for potential issues. Where's the vegetation at? Do we have some sedimentation issues going on here? We obviously don't have the plant establishment, and so we would come back from a maintenance perspective and we would require the owner to revegetate this and reestablish this. Also, your cobble here has got a lot of sediment in there that we'd be watching for. It's not going to reduce the flow of water here, which is what the intent of this is. And so we'd want to see those cleaned out in some of these annual maintenance inspections that we do and what we require the owner to be maintaining.
Yeah, so getting into a different feature, we'll move into filter strips for just a little bit. And one of the things that sets filter strips apart is they often allow water to infiltrate from sheet flow from impervious surfaces, such as like a roadway or a path or a parking lot. Often there's an emphasis on herbaceous vegetation, mainly grasses typically in filter strips. You'll hear them be referred to as grass filter strips. They're very good for low infiltration soils and also sloped areas as well, as opposed to bioretention areas or detention basins where you'll need a flat area to be graded into more of a lower profile. So here's a filter strip along the parking lot. Again, sheet flow coming from the parking lot and entering the filter strip. You see quite a bit of deer grass, perennial bunch grasses in here. I would like to see the middle a little bit more vegetated so it's not bare soil, which could potentially lead to suspended sediment in the water. But ultimately well vegetated, free of trash and debris.
And I just want to reiterate Aaron's point there is that we really, during the inspection process and the maintenance process, we really want to look at the path of flow. And you don't want to see this channelization here. We really want to see this being filtered by the plants coming into there. And, you know, you can see the potential for a high flow for that to transport sediment and debris and trash. And, you know, that's really not the intent of LID for these types of features.
And again, just showing a diagram of a vegetated filter strip. Sometimes you'll see if they have really long runs along a larger slope, you'll see a check dam put in to slow down the water. Again, we want water to slow down as much as possible since pollution uptake is a function of time and species composition. So yeah, here's a great diagram just showing water sheet flowing off of the impervious surface and integrating with the vegetation. And again, these are really helpful. Filter strips are really helpful for contractors in areas where you have sloped surfaces, uneven surfaces. It's a good way to divert water into filter strips rather than having to regrade and install bioretention planters and things like that. Again, better for low infiltration soils. And again, focuses mostly on sheet flowing of water into these filter strips. Again, just continually talking about how they can be placed along impervious pathways, and sheet flow is the main thing. Again, larger ones might require check dams.
And contractors, I would tell you that upon completion, remove your silt fencing, right? We don't want to see this here. You know, the thing, especially in Santa Rosa, is that we've got the tiger salamanders and wildlife corridors that we need to actually maintain along these streams and creeks. And so just things to be mindful of is that, you know, when you leave the site, leave it so that this feature can actually function the way it was designed.
And again, we're talking about the same maintenance requirements, although some of them, each feature has some specialized requirements, but we really have a lot of overlapping. Mow as needed, but don't overmow, remove dead or dying vegetation. Fertilizers, especially I'd say in filter strips, don't use them because typically these filter strips are placed along an adjacent waterway that's already existing, keeping trash out as much as possible. Another one with filter strips is since they're typically grass lined, if you begin to see bare patches where the grass is dying out for whatever reason, then watching out for soil creeps where you can see sediment slowly flowing down. And since these are on typically slopes, you can get soil creeps from bare patches and allowing for sediment to discharge out of these features as well. So I think this is a pretty easy question for everyone of what's wrong with this feature. You know, you can see the shopping carts thrown into the feature, bare exposed soils, obviously. So creating sediment issues clearly. Don't have near 50% vegetation. You see the irrigation is there, so maybe this would lead to their irrigation is broken or they're not running it. Some sort of irrigation issue is happening. And you know, it kind of leads to the question, again, these are living, breathing things. And if you don't take care of them, sometimes they can actually be more harm than good, because now you have a filter strip that was dependent on vegetation to treat water. And now instead of a filter strip, you just have a strip of bare soil, which is going to be discharging quite a bit of sediment into your MS4. Again, same one, just looking the other way. Same thing, bare soils, not nearly 50% vegetated. There's trash in the feature as well. And you're going to have extreme sediment issues with this when it's raining. So now we'll see it raining, and it's a bit hard to tell, but that water is pretty turbid in some locations within that feature. So it is certainly causing sediment issues. No filtering of the vegetation whatsoever, or at least very minimal. Yeah, again, turbidity increase in the water. And with that, you're seeing more and more erosion. And clearly, it's a feature that's not being well taken care of. You see the trash and the shopping carts as well. So just another example, if you're not maintaining these features correctly, they can do more harm than good.
And we do see flow-through planters occasionally throughout the city, at least here in Santa Rosa. We see these typically where soils drain poorly, or you've got limited space for some of these features, but often these are placed alongside buildings or structures. And really, we want to see these maintained. We want to make sure that the water is infiltrating within that 72 hours. We're looking for trash and debris buildup. You know, the other thing is too, you know, just keeping people out of here and making sure that we're not compacting soils, which are designed to help infiltrate that water and to treat it. So these types of features are extremely useful in treating some of the rooftop drainage coming from some of these sites, and just something to consider for you design engineers as you're looking to incorporate LID into your drawings. You know, generally these tend to be smaller. You know, they can be placed in high abundance alongside those buildings. You know, the water is collecting in these features in a perforated pipe beneath the permeable soil, and then it flows into the storm drain treated. You know, often there's a liner that's associated with these. So during the inspection, we just want to make sure that we don't see that liner and that we're not seeing issues associated with that liner. Most of the time, you're not going to even notice that they're there. But during construction, you want to make sure that these types of features do get the liner because it is important for the functionality of this particular feature. So some of the maintenance requirements, again, this ponded water, is the high flow inlet, is it free of obstruction? A lot of times, especially near a commercial building, you can see these tend to get inundated with trash. So just making sure that the owner or responsible party there is actually maintaining that, not using the pesticides or fertilizers in these features, and pruning accordingly as well. I think some pruning is good. I definitely don't want to see it over pruned either. And then, you know, depending on how the water's coming into this feature, is just making sure that you're looking at that downspout and that splash block to make sure that it's, you know, preventing any sort of erosion or rilling going on in these features.
Okay, we have our last question of the day. Elizabeth, do you want to bring it up? Okay, take a little time and select what you think is appropriate.
10 or 15 seconds more, and then I'll close it. Okay, sharing the results now.
All right, thank you. Yoash, you want to?
Thank you, Kevin.
No.
So above our all common names, let's dive in a little bit and further understand how these commonly used names in actual low impact development best management practices that have been approved for construction and will be subject to monitoring over the lifetime of the LID BMP. Bioretention is synonymous with rain garden. This type of LID BMP is defined as a permanent, typically small scale, although large scale is acceptable, and I repeated this earlier, planted features that aim to mimic the hydrologic function of the pre-development site by capturing, treating, and infiltrating stormwater as close to the source as possible. At plant maturity, at least 50% of a BMP must be vegetated for the BMP to be considered an LID BMP per the BMP selection table, that is Appendix A, B in the LID manual. Bioretention facilities are standalone BMPs. There are LID BMPs types that are rather composed of a treatment train, as I described earlier, which means that the LID BMP will function only if all components are installed and maintained. These types of LID BMP are described in the manual as follows. Alternatively, a BMP can be considered to be an LID BMP if the hydro modification control BMP design criteria is met and at least one vegetated water quality BMP or runoff reduction measure is utilized to provide water quality treatment prior to discharge to volume capture BMP. That's from page 9 of the manual. Now, interceptor trees, disconnected roof drains, paved area disconnect, buffer strips, and bovine terraces are all examples of vegetated treatment components that can be used in a treatment train to satisfy the treated and volume capture requirements. The credit, if taken, must be between the pollutant source and the low impact development BMP. The treatment component must be located between the pollutant source, say the new driveway or the house, and the low impact development BMP, with no obstructions in between, and must be maintained in perpetuity in the same manner without modifying the configuration, say pouring a concrete pad after 10 years over the vegetated buffer area, which is the reason for having the maintenance agreement signed by the owners of the property before construction is final, so they are aware. Thank you, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Yoash. Aaron and Nick?
Thanks, Yoash, and that's a great segue into treatment trains that we're going to talk about for a little bit here. And treatment trains, they use a variety of features, just as Yoash was saying, to achieve stormwater quality. And typically, as we drop down into the lower priority features, that's when we're going to be seeing treatment trains installed to achieve volume capture and treat runoff. Things that we'll see are trash capture devices, porous pavement, interceptor trees, infiltration trenches, filter inserts, and biofilters on tree pods. In this picture here, we have porous pavement as well as vegetated bioretention and interceptor trees that are all being used together as a treatment train. And we'll move on and kind of dig into that a little bit more. This is a great graphic. I'm sorry to everyone how blurry it is, but I really do like what it's trying to portray here, where you'll have rooftop drainage and water sheds off of that, and it goes into permeable pavement and then goes into a vegetated swale. then continues off permeable pavement, and then where you see the cars parked, you'll have impervious surfaces, which then goes into a vegetated swale, and so on and so forth until you get to your bioretention planter. So I think this is just a good diagram to show how you can utilize various features to be a composite of a treatment train and achieve volume capture.
If I may jump in, Aaron, one second. Just the permeable pavement does not provide any treatment. It just conveys the runoff. So the treatment train is the treatment component and the volume capture, just so we're all clear. That's just a conveyance mechanism for that 1 inch of rain. That's what the permeable pavement does.
Correct. Thanks. And just taking a look at porous pavement. Oh, Nick, you want to take this one actually?
It's okay.
I just get excited.
We're doing good. It's all right. We'll make it. So just to really quick, I just want to, especially for the contractors and the landscapers on the line, is that the porous pavement can be part of an LID treatment train. And Yoash is right. This is designed to convey and infiltrate from these features, but needs to be used in conjunction with other LID features. But I want you to be aware of that as you install it, because you're also going to be required to not only install it correctly, but also for owners and landscapers to maintain it. And really what we're trying to do is make sure that this is clean from debris and fine sediment. It's swept up or even vacuumed up on a regular basis. We don't want to see you pressure washing these. It tends to force dirt into the porous spaces and clogs it. We need to really make sure that there's ensure that there's effective infiltration. And I'll tell you right now, our preference right now is leaning more towards the top picture, which is the permeable pavers, versus the bottom, which is the porous concrete, just for ease of maintenance. And you may see this being modified in future manuals in our for our LID. So just some things to be mindful of as you move forward. But I will tell you that we're learning that the porous concrete is very difficult to maintain, and in some instances has had to be taken out and replaced with features that require less maintenance due to the clogging.
Yeah, and I'll say, just as an inspecting these features, I've gone out and looked at features that were just recently installed with porous concrete and gone out during wet weather, and you see the water is completely bypassing them and going into a catch basin. So it's been a difficult thing to work with, seeing just how much maintenance in terms of keeping those pores clear really goes into porous concrete.
The other, if I may, just 1 second, Nick, also on porous pavement, we don't allow permitting of those on driving surfaces, on movement, because the material just breaks up. Only on parking areas where it stands and there's no movement of the cars on it, of the vehicles.
So some of the things we're looking for when we inspect these is we're looking actually in that porous space, and we're making sure that all the fines are removed. We don't have any trash or other particulates in there. We want to see that these are maintained and free from obstructions, so that water can flowly free through those voids. You know, they can get clogged over time. It's really tempting probably to bring a pressure washer here. We don't want to see that. We actually want to see these cleaned up in a less obtrusive way.
Nick, are you talking about vacuuming then?
You know, yes, I think you can vacuum. It just depends on really how big of an area you're treating and how easy that's going to be. I just think you need to be cognizant of means and methods here, because you could start to create a bigger issue for yourself if you start to clog those voids and you don't have the infiltration that's required as a result of these. I think it's going to be, I think it's a situation by situation here, Elizabeth.
So on the permeable pavement, on the porous pavement, the porous concrete, so there's saying that you don't even like using those, and I still see them being proposed. So I'm wondering if they keep up, say, I was thinking twice a year, but do you think suctioning them 4 times a year would actually make them okay? Or like Aaron was saying, even after they've just been put in, they're still not any good?
I think it all depends.
I would tell you from my experience that it depends on where they're installed, one, and what they're accepting. But, you know, using City Hall as an example, you know, we clean that out And I would say in 2 to 3 weeks after cleaning, it was clogged again. We eventually had to take that out and put a slot drain in order to meet the intent of the LID. So it's location, 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 but it's also about maintenance of it. And I think it's something just to be aware of, especially if you're inspecting them, that frequency may need to be increased depending on where they installed it. I would say curb and gutter is really awful. You tend to get a lot of stormwater runoff and it tends to clog pretty quickly. You know, maybe a walkway or a pathway might actually work. But again, these are things that, you know, the design community is probably going to want to take a closer look at.
Yep, well said.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, just here's an example of permeable concrete right here, and water's allowed to infiltrate from here initially. And what doesn't runs off along the gutter. There's a curb cut going into the infiltration planter, and then water can run alongside during high flows and then directly into the catch basin. So just this really small example of a treatment drain. Here's another one where permeable concrete or porous pavement is tied to a planter or bioretention planter. So you can kind of see that the sediment accumulation right here, obviously this is a productive tributary where water is flowing and you're in a parking lot. So sediment from cars and all of that is collecting here. And, you know, as we're talking about this porous concrete, you know, I could look at this and immediately know that if I came out here during wet weather, I would almost guarantee that the water is completely bypassing this porous concrete and it's just going directly into the planter. So what was initially designed and the initial intent is not being achieved. And like what Nick was saying, when these are installed in gutters or in places where you're having high productivity of cars and things like that, they just get clogged immediately. You know, there is a place for it in terms of walkways and things like that. But when you're dealing with vehicles and road runoff, they get clogged almost immediately. And they're simply, the maintenance issues on that are astronomical.
And one of the things, just really quick from an inspection and a maintenance standpoint, if you're seeing the sedimentation here, you're going to anticipate that this cobble or this drain rock also is inundated with some of that sediment and is going to need some maintenance. So things to watch for and things to address during your maintenance inspections and care here.
You know, what maintenance issues do you see here, right? It's kind of going along the same vein here with the porous concrete, where you can get vegetation from overhanging trees that are grinding and then beginning to clog those pores and decreasing porosity. So again, you could look at something like this and know that it's probably not going to be very permeable and the infiltration rates greatly decreased or is not there.
And again, you know, putting permeable concrete around the type of vegetation that is surrounding this property may not have been the best idea. You can see how much leaf debris is actually being put in here and is going to be an ongoing maintenance issue for this particular project.
And again, just scooting over, if we were to take a step to our left, if we had our camera, you'd be looking at a curb cut, allowing water to infiltrate into a planter strip. And same thing, you see the sediment accumulation on the porous concrete. And I would say that this is most likely not functioning correctly.
Nick and Aaron, I think now may be a good time to quickly address some previous questions about previous pavement. We had Dustin and Andy asking about if the Regional Water Board is allowing pervious pavement and what some issues are with that. And I think in particular, they were referring to the use of pervious pavement as permeable gutter pans, where you're trying to get water from the street into a bioretention basin. But rather than doing a curb cut, putting in a permeable gutter pan where water infiltrates through the pervious pavement and then goes underground into the bioretention unit. And what we're finding based on experiences from the municipalities is that these permeable gutter pans inevitably fail. So we are not wanting to see those anymore. And currently through our 401 certification process, when a project comes in and they're proposing a permeable gutter pan, we've been pushing those projects back to the applicant and say, find another way to get your water into your bioretention unit, because this is inevitably going to fail. And we don't want to have to deal with making you rip up your road and replacing, retrofitting your curb to get water into your bioretention unit another way. So we're going to address that in the next permit, but in the meantime, we're dealing with it kind of on a case-by-case basis through the 401 certification process and through discussions with the municipalities, trying to get them to discourage its use.
Yeah, Brendan, and I'm seeing a lot of that, and it can get kind of frustrating right now where we'll go out and do initial inspections on newly constructed sites, and you're seeing that they're using the porous concrete as a way to infiltrate into bioretention on these brand new, spanking new features. And it's a bit frustrating to see that that's the mechanism, and knowing that, like you said, we know it's going to fail. And I'm hoping we can get away from that as soon as possible. So I'm glad you're highlighting that.
And just to be respectful of time, we're at 11. So for those of you that have to jump off, we are recording this and we will send a link out. So if you want to catch the end and can't stay on, we'll happy to do that. We have a few more slides to go, and so we'll push through here and try to jam through this last little bit.
Yeah, so annual maintenance, just checking the adjacent landscape and washout potential, using a vacuum sweeper to clear out as much as you can in terms of the sediment and leaves collecting, removing weeds, and that comes to the porous pavers where you have the squares. We can see weeds growing in between those squares or those cracks. And testing for permeability is the biggest thing in my opinion, and testing that out as much as you possibly can to see if they are actually functioning. Because again, when they're in these high productive areas such as gutters, we'll find that they need to be cleaned out much more often than others.
Some other things you might see as part of a treatment train is rain catchment. Again, this is for flow attenuation. It's reducing the hydromodification. It's delaying the release into the receiving waters, which is helping with that. And so it also, in the summer months, depending on how much water is stored, it could help reduce the need for irrigation or allow some of the captured stormwater to be used for the irrigation of the LID features. Obviously when we're inspecting these, we're making sure that these do hold water. We'd want to see water come out of this high flow bypass up here the way it was designed. I do think that some of these have a bypass valve. We just want to make sure it's not in the open position. I'm not going to go through this, but this is kind of just showing a design drawing of how that's used in sequence with the treatment train. This is that feature functioning. You've got water, it's falling from the sky, it's coming from the roof, it's filling your rainwater catchment. You've got water that's coming into your LID feature and is being treated in real time. And then as time goes on, you have that water from the rainwater capture that's then released into the swale here and slowly released into the receiving water. So there's some benefits there. The other thing that you might see in conjunction with some of your LID features is the trash capture devices. Again, just wanted to point it out because they are on sites. They are part of some of these maintenance declarations for owners to maintain. And some of these engineered systems do require a third party to come in and actually clean them out, provide certifications so that we can verify you're in compliance with the requirements in your maintenance declaration. So again, just really wanted to kind of point these out to show you that you might have these features on your site, and or if you're a design engineer, to call these out so that the contractor and the engineers know, or the contractors and the owners know that they've got them there. The other thing is too, lessons learned over a period of time is that sometimes these are installed without the right access points, and it makes it very difficult to maintain and clean. So just making sure that those are part of the project plan and design. Interceptor trees are just as important. So the trees on site, are there intentionally most of the time when you have LID features, and they're meant to intercept that stormwater. They allow for some evapotranspiration to happen from the tree. And the rainwater kind of is going to take the path of least resistance and come down the tree trunk. And again, that's to help reduce the velocity of that raindrop, which disperses, breaks up that sediment, which then causes stormwater issues. So it is an important part of the treatment train, and it is something that we do inspect. So if you have 20 interceptor trees on your site, when we come out to inspect, we will look at all 20 of those trees. It is a regional board requirement, and things that property owners on transfer of ownership will need to know too, that they can't just replace a tree or take down a tree without proper, replacement of that tree or approval of the types of tree that are being installed. This is an example of an inspection checklist that we follow. And again, I just wanted to point out here that what we're looking for is common in every feature. We're looking at the drainage of the feature. We're looking at erosion that's associated with that feature. We're looking at the vegetation in that feature. And then occasionally you will get a feature that is uniquely designed and has specific maintenance requirements that we will also note as well. And those are typically recorded in that final LID submittal. And those are things just to be aware of. And so just as the more detail you can provide to owners on how they can maintain this, the better of chance they have passing a compliance inspection from a municipality. This is just a quick top 10 maintenance issues that we would see is, again, vegetation, the erosion and channelization, sedimentation, obstructed inlets and outlets, low plant density, the weeds in the features themselves, trash and debris, standing water. And then sometimes these features do get damaged just by the way that they're designed. And so just making sure that those are being maintained and protected accordingly, and that they're being addressed.
Yeah, and here's just a general calendar of the inspection list. And we don't have to go through every single bullet point here, but again, we have this recording. So I think this would be a great thing to refer to for maintenance staff if you want to come back to this. But generally in the spring, you're going to be dealing with your weeding and making sure you're staying on top of invasives. And that moves into summer as well, because we do have summer invasives that germinate. And then as you get into summer, making sure that your irrigation system is working effectively and you're watering the plants if needed. Once they're well established, that's where you can make the judgment call to see if they're tapped in and ready to go or not. In the fall, it's again just staying on top of weeds and any dying vegetation. You're probably going to stop your irrigation sometime depending on the wet weather and when it comes in fall, and making sure that your inlets are ready for wet weather. And then winter, it's really just inspecting your features, making sure sediment isn't accumulating and making sure your high flow bypass is functioning correctly and it's allowing water to enter, as well as your inlets, and making sure that everything is working correctly when it comes to the hydrology of your feature. And just some maintenance hazards that you might have to look out for when you're working on these features, trips and falls, making sure you're on steady ground. Some of these features might be soft. If you're in the wet weather, they might have soft areas or gopher holes or things like that. Make sure you have safe access, because some of these features are along roadways, busy roadways by that. So making sure you're safe when doing so. Any utilities that might be nearby, any biohazards that could have come from stormwater and ultimately entered in your feature. We've seen cases of ground wasp nesting in features. Poison oak can grow in there as well. So it's just things to be mindful of when maintaining these features. And knowing is half the battle. By understanding the intended function of LID, you can identify areas with maintenance needs. So right after this training, the hope is that you can go out on your drive or when you're walking around the park or anything, and you can see a feature and know, hey, is that functioning as intended? Am I seeing sediment accumulate? Are those the plants that should be there? Does it need to get mowed? Does it need to get weeded? So, and on that point, when in doubt, contact your local municipality, contact us, the water board. If you ever have questions about, hey, what's wrong with this feature? What's going on here? When in doubt, let us know. We depend on you as the eyes and ears for letting us know when to inspect these features and to see if there's any maintenance that's needed. And just on our role, stormwater here, we're tracking and documenting all new LID features that come into the city. And ultimately, this LID is a new practice, right? And our first manual was 2005. So this is relatively new. And I expect that we're going to see an exponential growth of LID features coming in our city. And what we have now, in terms of the number of features, we're going to see so many more in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So we need to stay on track of these features, make sure they're being installed correctly and make sure they're being maintained correctly. And that's where our annual inspections come in of all these features to make sure that they're okay. And then if they aren't and they need some corrective actions, it's using those maintenance declarations and finding ownership and making sure that these are being addressed. So these LID features are functioning to their intent, because ultimately, like we said at the beginning of this presentation, why do we care? We care because we want our stormwater to be clean and we want to take care of this environment as best we can. And we're locked into the impervious surfaces that we've built from our past. And that's simply not changing. I don't foresee us ripping out our roads and our highways and going back to, the 1500s. So we want to address this how we can, and we're human beings and we come up with solutions and we solve these complex issues with the environment. And LID is just one of those tools where we can apply into our world and into our development and deal with this and clean our water as best we can. And required documents for us when we deal with our inspections, the big three I would say are maintenance declaration, the final LID submittal. Previous years they were called final SUSUMPs, but now we're getting into calling them final LID submittals, which Nick went over all the various components of that. And then the as-belts, the improvement plans really help as well to show what was intended to be built here. It's really vital to the success of our inspections of these features, which again, I think feeds into making sure that the ownership is maintaining these as best as possible. And just to summarize for this presentation is that LID helps lower the impact of impervious surfaces by treating and capturing, right? So we're treating pollutants and we're capturing the volume to decrease hydromodification. I know I keep saying it, but I just want to drill home as much as possible to everyone that these are living, breathing components. These are living, breathing features. They require ongoing maintenance. These aren't things you walk away from. You don't construct a catch basin and walk away. You don't construct this LID feature and walk away. You need to continually maintain these to keep them functioning per their intent. Like I said, LID is the future. It's here and it's going to be here and we're going to continue to utilize it. And if we utilize it correctly, it's a fantastic tool that developers can use to essentially eliminate their impact to our waterways, which we all are here for because we all care about that.
So this is our close to final slide, and just wanted to throw this up for those of you still on as some additional resources if you wanted to kind of look for more information of LID and what we've talked about here. And then one thing I want to point out too, on the bottom down here in the city of Santa Rosa, we actually do weekly watering recommendations based on current climate and temperature. And so in Santa Rosa, at least, you can call and you can find out how much you need to be watering your plants, especially which is critical during plant establishment. And you guys are going to be receiving a brief survey here from Andrew Strickland, who is with the city of Ukiah regarding this training, which we would really appreciate your feedback and is really important for the way that we develop these going forward. And what we focus on for future presentations. So please, when you get that, if you can take 2 or 3 minutes and fill out that survey, it is useful, it's used, it's looked at, and greatly appreciated. And again, I just want to thank you for your time. And here's Aaron's information and my information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Appreciate you guys hanging out just a little bit longer and for being a part of this training.
Yeah, and I want to thank you. And so we do have some questions that we didn't hit on. Like I said, I think, the co-permittees will stay on. We'll go through the questions. As we've already said, the presentation is being recorded. We'll get it posted. We'll send out a link to where you can find it in the next few days. But I'm with Nick. Nick and Aaron, I think you guys did a great job. I think I was like that cherry on top that put that whole thing over, but you guys did 99.9 and I did my 0.001, but I think it was a great training. I got a number of questions. I'm going to just start with the ones that have already been asked. I think Brendan already answered the permeable pavement ones. This is from Jesus Fernandez. Brendan answered it, but his question was, what priority is the filter strip and does it achieve only treatment? I think Brendan answered that in the chat. Jesus, I know with the city of Santa Rosa, I'm going to butcher your last name. I think it's McKeague. He asks, regarding treatment trains, how are both treatment and storage elements sized and calculated using the calculator? So I don't know if anyone wants to take that one. Come on, someone.
You wanna repeat the question one more time?
Sure. He asks, regarding treatment trains, how are both treatment and storage elements sized and calculated using the calculator?
All right, well, that's a technical question, design, and I don't know how much you want to get into it right now. So.
Well, in terms of, go ahead.
This is Heaven. I was just going to say, in the interest of time, I won't get into the details except to say that the calculator is built to calculate both separately and combined. So you have that option, and they would need to be, sized for their respective function. So there's a portion of the calculator that does treatment and a portion of the calculator that does volume. And you would need to run both of those calculations.
Okay, thank you, Heaven. Jessica Politz, I'm sorry if I missed your last name, but it says, as a design engineer, I have struggled to find a compromise between desired infiltration of the subgrade and the geotechnical engineer's compaction requirements for drivable pervious surfaces. So I did.
Can I say, Heaven, do you want to talk?
Just really briefly, I would say yes, that is one of the unique challenges of looking at permeable use, is what other constraints need to be met by that particular location. So in a roadway, you're going to need to look at that. In some cases, a structural soil might be an option. In other cases, and again, depending on your site-specific limitations or demands, it might be that permeable pavement would only be appropriate on things like patios and walkways instead of the drivable surface.
Okay, thank you. Carol Dugas wrote, if porous pavement is used and it presents that it makes the project under 10,000 square feet, then is it true that no other BMP is required? So I think what she's asking, that if you use porous pavement and it makes the project under 10,000 square feet, are additional BMPs required?
Did she mean 5,000 square feet?
Well, Carol, you're on. Do you mind unmuting and ask your question?
10,000 square feet, actually.
Yeah, but if you repair or replace it, you'd still trigger it if it was over the 10,000 square foot threshold. So
I think the question here about is someone is trying to take a credit, right? This is a big question that comes up, is we want to take a credit to reduce the size of the BMP. I think this is where this is coming from. And so,
So Carol,
so the project is just barely maybe 11,000 square feet. So the designer suggests putting in 1,500 square foot of pervious pavement so that he's under the trigger of the 10,000 square feet. So then they don't want to do any other design elements. So is that okay?
Brendan, or do you?
No,
Yeah.
sorry, Heather, I was typing an answer to one of the questions in the chat and I didn't get all of that. So if you
Oh,
did.
that's okay. Yeah, so I'm going to restate it one more time just for everybody. So that goes back to just how permeable pavement is defined, as either a permeable or an impermeable surface. So it really goes back to what the design is on the kind of complete project. So if you have a project you're placing, as you say, 1,100 square feet instead of, 11,000 square feet instead of 10,000 square feet. So you're going to make that last 1,000 square feet permeable. That I have seen that occur. And that's an interesting approach to try and minimize. Generally, we look at permeable pavement as a runoff reduction measure and approach to kind of reducing the necessary size of a BMP. So it would really depend on the specifics of the site if you're hitting that threshold for removal and replacement.
So it's not strictly counted as permeable surface, even though it's called a permeable pavement. It doesn't count. So that if it was right at the borderline of the trigger, that they wouldn't have to apply their stormwater LID features.
And this is a part of the LID manual. We really tried to get into the nuance because without spending too much time here, permeable pavement and really other paving materials, like compacted, lime treated, gravel parking lots, right? So it really has to do with how it's intended to function and whether the design prohibits or allows for infiltration to occur. And so the reason I'm hedging is that a lot of it is site specific.
Okay, thanks, Evan. The next one, Carolina Avalar asks, are there any ADA requirements with porous pavement? Noticing the gaps between each paver may pose an issue for people with wheelchairs or other mobility aids, such as walkers.
So I don't know if someone from one of the cities wants to respond to that, but I would definitely say, ADA requirements still apply, even if it's an LID feature. And it is an important component to consider in terms of the appropriate use. So not all permeable pavers have gaps. Some are permeable by design in other ways, or those gaps are filled with permeable material. But it's definitely an important consideration.
Okay, thanks, Evan. And so just so you know, questions that were asked in the chat that were either answered by Brendan, I think Kellen, she also answered a few. I'm skipping those because those are in the chat. I'm really going to hit the ones that were not answered in the chat room or in the chat feature. So Becky Price Hall wrote, I have seen moss growing in the cracks of pavers. Does moss provide treatment as the water flows between or across the moss? Would some amount of moss be an acceptable vegetation in an LID feature? And then she has in parentheses, in coastal areas.
And I answered that below. I said, I'm
okay.
not, yeah. But the answer is, I'm not aware of any studies showing water quality treatment benefits for moss. If you come across any, bring them to our attention. In the meantime, it would not be an acceptable alternative to vegetation-based treatment.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Brendan.
I don't think you would have enough moss because the amount that's between cracks, I would think would not be significant, even if it was an effective pollutant capture.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have this from Dustin. A local municipality has requested that bioretention BMPs in the public right of way. And then in parentheses, he has subdivision parkways in front of homes be irrigated with a system independent of the individual lots. Is this a trend? And how does irrigation and maintenance work without an HOA or landscape assessment district? Are homeowner maintenance covenants not working / being enforced?
Oh, I can answer the last part about that. They're definitely being enforced.
Okay.
We don't have a buy on that. We are, as a municipality, we're trying to work as best as we can with homeowners that are individually responsible, understanding some of the constraints and the lack of information of how these may have been transferred to them. But we are gingerly nudging them towards compliance, and so they can expect to see more of that as we go forward. New homeowners that are responsible for LID maintenance can expect to see kind of a more robust approach upon them coming into their homes. And so some of the things that, at least for the city of Santa Rosa, that we're kind of considering, and that may be coming down here in the next year or two, is that we may be reaching out to the homeowners upon sale or transfer and giving them information about their LID features, because we're realizing that that's a gap right now with the construction community, that, you know, homeowners are not appropriately informed of the features and their requirements. So even though you're signing a plethora of, you know, paperwork when you buy a home, a lot of times that gets buried in the mix, and it's not until we show up and say that you now need to replace your feature because you've destroyed the whole thing that it really starts to get someone's attention. So that's at least the back half of that for me.
The first half on that, this is Elizabeth from Windsor. So we require them when they're in the public right of way to be separated, because they are in the public right of way. So the town is then going to be paying for that water. And so it has to be separate from the homeowners. Now, I know it says without an HOA or a landscape assessment district, we require them to be put in one or the other. If it's going to be privately maintained for some reason, it has to be in an HOA. If it's going to be publicly maintained, it has to go in the landscape district. So maybe there's another city that doesn't have one or the other, but if it's in the public right away, then it has to be separate from the homeowner because it's being maintained by somebody else.
And that's a provision in our permit that the regional board is required. That's beyond our municipalities. Yeah.
I would just point out, you know, this is maybe a quick side note, but it's related, you know, that I think Nick stressed really, you know, really well that these are part of the storm drain system, and that these are systems, and you know, the plants in them are vital. They're part of the design. It's how we get pollutant removal, is with the plants and the microbes that live in healthy soil and plant zone or in root zones of plants. So when we look at drought restrictions on watering of and irrigation of landscape, you know, these are not regular landscape. These are required stormwater treatment features that are part of the storm drain infrastructure. And I think that can be a bit confusing out in the world, because unless you've been through these trainings and have an eye for knowing what you're looking at, it can be confusing to a layperson as to why this landscape's getting water and maybe others aren't. So I just wanted to pause there for a second and point out, you know, the importance, especially if you get, you know, we stop irrigating these entirely. Now, hopefully most of these are, you know, it's only at establishment and very little supplemental water from that point out. But, you know, you could have a hard time reestablishing an entire LID feature. Takes a much bigger lift than keeping plants healthy and happy that are in there from the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Heaven. Question from Jesus Fernandez. If a road is listed as a disconnected paved area that is counted for runoff reduction measures credit, can the road just sheet flow to vegetation? Or does the entire road need to go to an LID? And then he writes, it seems if the LID is reduced due to the credit, the stormwater from the road would convey more water than the LID can handle.
Yeah, so again, this is going to depend on the nuance of the design, but conceptually, right, we this disconnected impervious surface and the area that's receiving the runoff from it need to be appropriately sized so that you don't have issues of scour or blowout in high flow condition, and that you're thinking about, you know, your 10, 50, 100-year storm event and flood control, as well as your water quality event. That's really true for all of this discussion here, is that, you know, we need to be thoughtful about it being functional and useful at, you know, for these lower intensity 1-inch rain events, water quality events, as well as our high flow atmospheric river events, and making sure that we don't damage the BMPs, the LID features, and also that we provide adequate high flow bypass to ensure protection of the public right of way and associated, you know, adjacent homes and businesses. I know that's a generic answer, but I think it gets to the heart of the issue here, which is possibly, possibly yes, a portion of a roadway or a driveway or a you know, sidewalk paved area could be disconnected and go to a landscape area in order to reduce the size of the downstream system. But there needs to be careful contemplation of the high flow events as well.
Okay, thank you, Heaven. All right, so I'm going to throw it out. Here's your last chance to ask, you know, Heaven and Brendan, Regional Board, and all the other municipalities. If you have a question about LID, now's the time to ask it. Does anyone have a final question or two?
And, you know, I would ask that if you're one of the 10 co-permittees on the MPS permit, that you would turn your camera on so people can identify you. That would be great.
Yes. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
So does anyone have a question for
Like Jeff has his hand up.
Yeah, Jeff
Kevin?
has his hand up.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin and Nick. I guess one clarification. I really appreciate the presentation, first of all, before I get into my clarification, but all the presenters did a fabulous job and it was great information. One of the things that was noted that Brendan, you noted earlier, and the NRMCA agrees, that's the National Ready Mix Concrete Association. They basically point out the problems that we have by trying to use permeable concrete gutter pans as a sole source for getting stormwater into bioretention areas because they fill up with sediment. So there are other situations where we use permeable concrete or permeable pavements inside a design. One example of that is that Cal Green requires it for certain types of development. And so when we're doing that, it makes the most sense, obviously, not to have those permeable concretes or pavements at the high end of the site. We typically want to have them at the lower end of the site. And that's the same location that we're putting our bioretention areas. So I noticed in a couple of those pictures that Aaron had up on the screen that we had permeable pavements in close proximity to the bioretention areas. And I think that's a really good design because it gives us the ability to have porous rock underneath those sections. So even though the surfaces, if the landscape areas aren't being maintained, and even if those porous pavements are starting to see some sediment and it's blocking flow into those planter areas, we still have porous rock that's beneath them. And you can have lateral movement of water from those bioretention areas into those porous spaces. And that can actually help with our hydro modification. So, I mean, as a designer, I think I'd rather see those permeable pavements closer to the bioretention areas because that's where we're taking all of our water. And then we can take advantage of it from a volume capture perspective because that water is naturally going to want to migrate back into those permeable spaces. And just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I will defer to Heaven since she's the engineer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a natural place for them. I think that, you know, everyone here in these presentations have talked about this isn't an iterative approach, and I will humbly say that I have learned a lot and continue to as we move, you know, through versions of these manuals and discussions statewide and with others. And so I would say, yes, that seems like a natural location and use. And I understand there's other reasons for permeable pavement. One of the considerations and you know, concerns that we're looking at with permeable is simply making sure that the treatment step isn't being short-circuited. And we're fortunate in Region 1 particularly to have really high quality groundwater that we're working hard to protect. So it's just another component as we move through iterations going forward to look at and make sure that we're getting the benefits from all of the tools in our toolbox, but also not short circuiting the process of, treatment and then infiltration.
May I add, Heathen?
Hmm?
I think that permeable pavement, from my experience, like I said earlier, the structural integrity of it is not the same as of typical AC. And so that is why I mentioned earlier, we'd rather see those under the parking space by the curb opening, which leads to the bioretention facility, rather than through the traveling aisle in the parking lot, because that will fail over time.
Yeah, and I guess I'm speaking about, permeable pavement, and really it's permeable paving in a generic sense. There's a variety of different types of permeable paving materials. And so, of course, each site you're going to need to look at what's appropriate for use. But I think, Jeff, to your thinking that, hey, these are going to often occur, adjacent to bioretention or bioswales or other features, I expect that may be appropriate for many of these designs, as long as we're not short circuiting, if you will, the treatment component, but rather just expanding a subsurface footprint.
Thank you.
I just want to say, Jeff, it's great to have you on and actually meet you virtually. I can see your name stamped all the time. It's nice to put a face to a stamp.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that.
Okay, for the sake of time, I have one last question from Ben. So let's just take this one, and then I think we'll call it today. Before I do that, though, I do want to say, there's still 64 people on this call, which really tells you the interest in this topic. And to Nick's point, please fill out the survey. It'll help us really improve upon what's been presented today. So the last question from Ben, where do we get the value for infiltration rate and porosity in the calculator? Is that typically specified from geotech, or is it a recommended value? Who wants to take the last question?
I will always talk.
But okay.
So generally, it's going to depend on what material you specify. So you're going to be working with your supplier to look at what's available, whether you're doing a light fluffy bioretention planting mix, or if you're doing a structural soil or something else. You'll want to look at, you want to really be thoughtful and ensure, because these calculations really do hinge on what your values are for the soil and medium you're putting in, particularly for the volume capture requirement. And then you really need to be careful that you don't deviate from that. Making a change in material selection that's maybe instead of 30% void ratio, 20% void ratio would have a substantial impact on the BMP that would ultimately need to be put in, and whether it meets the required sizing. So work with your supplier and make sure it meets a specification that you are using in your calculation.
Yeah, and this is Elizabeth. I think you can use, like, USDA can give you infiltration rates for the soils that are at your site. And of course, geotech is always better because they're going to give you site-specific information, and they should be addressing that, because even values at USDA are not site-specific. So it's always better to use the geotech. We always use that report to look and see what type of soils there are to determine what kind of infiltration rate we should expect when we're looking at the design and we're looking at the calculations.
Okay, thank you, Heaven and Elizabeth. Okay, with that, I think we're going to call it a day. Again, thank you for attending. You will receive an email from Andrew Strickland. It's a survey. Please fill it out. Again, it'll help us improve. And then also, I got one last message. Irma says thank you. And then also we will get this training posted, and we'll send you the link to that through an email as well within the next few days. With that,
I want to say thank you to the regional board too for attending and participating, and really appreciate you being a valuable partner and helping us with our compliance.
Yeah, Brendan, you know, haven't answered all the verbal, but you were doing a lot of answering in through the chat. So thank you for doing that. And Kellen too. Thank you for doing that as well. With that, everyone, please have a good day, and we will talk to you all soon. Thanks.